The young man looked at his father and said that he knew this day would come. Duke Effenberg looked at his son in bewilderment and asked what day exactly and what he meant. Bastian Effenberg looked at his father with a smile and said that he wanted to marry Luc Bichel. The Duke in turn thought with bewilderment, since this decision seemed extremely strange to him. Bastian smiled and told his father not to pretend he hadn't heard, as he had threatened him with this before. Bastian looked at his stunned father and said that he didn't care what he thought, since he had already decided everything. Bastian said that it was a very profitable match. Luc is the only heir of the family. He said the young lady had strength, looks, and talent, and was perfect as a wife. The Duke was stunned and needed time to think, as he knew that his son feared her more than death. The most handsome young man in the kingdom of Bastian. His appearance earned him the nickname Angel. His position in society corresponded to this nickname. When the Duke learned that he had a son, he wept. After the birth, the whole house was filled with joy, because this child was the most desired, the Duke's only heir and successor. He was the Duke's treasure. But unfortunately, his upbringing was not the best. The Duke was talented, responsible, and intelligent. Everyone praised him for his noble firmness. But in front of his son, he became completely different, like cotton candy dissolved in water. But what is even more surprising is that the Duke was the king's cousin. The young boy had literally everything, from a wonderful position in society to the love of his parents. Without looking at the maid, he sighed heavily and said that the carrots were unnecessary. Bastian looked at the maid and said that he had already worn these things yesterday. He told her to find him other clothes. He told his father to change the teacher because he was annoying him. His father said that the teacher was the best of the best. The Duke knew that Luc was a renowned monster hunter. He knew that their marriage wasn't that bad. The Duke, in turn, always used the girl as a means of blackmailing his son. The most famous royal knight in the kingdom. She has no equal in magic. Everyone admired her, but she ruthlessly destroys her targets, sparing neither effort nor means. The Duke always shouted at his son that if he was capricious, he would give him to Luc. The Duke told his son that the young lady hated spoiled children like him. The Duke's words, in turn, were effective to the point of will, and the most terrible threat was the wedding. The Duke looked at his son and asked why he had missed the lesson, since that was not what the Duke had taught him. The young man sighed heavily and said that he didn't want to go there. The Duke was shocked because he knew his son was too nice and he could not punish him. The Duke told his son that he couldn't just do whatever he wanted. The young man asked in bewilderment why, since he knew that he was the son of the Grand Duke, the king's brother. The Duke angrily told his son that despite all his privileges, he worked all day long. The Duke looked at his son and said that there would be a banquet at the royal palace that day, and he needed to accompany his mother. Bastian said he had nothing to wear. The Duke asked in shock, "What do you mean, since he had the largest wardrobe?" The knight said that the young master did not like the shoes, and for this reason, he burned them all. The knight said that they had ordered black shoes, but they were not the shade the young gentleman wanted. The young man said that everyone would look at him, and the shoes were the wrong shade, and he didn't need low-quality shoes. The Duke angrily asked his son how he was going to survive at the Royal Academy, since he not only missed the lesson, but also burned his clothes. The young man shuddered and drooped. A moment later, he said that he was going to the banquet after all, and the Duke sighed heavily. The banquet at the royal palace was a great success. Everyone was having fun and chatting casually. A moment later, everyone greeted the Duchess and her son with smiles. The young man smiled a radiant smile and greeted the guests. The young ladies were simply amazed by the angel who came down from heaven. The young people looked at the Duchess and said with a smile that her son was very handsome and polite. They said he was like an angel, but the Duchess in turn knew that it looked like a joke. The young men discussed the banquet that His Majesty had arranged in honor of Victory Day Luc Bichel. The young lady smiled and said that it was all true, and that Luc was simply incredible. The young man sighed heavily as he passed by all the guests, and they were all talking about the young lady. A moment later, looking at his mother, he called her and asked if he could go out into the fresh air. He smiled and said that he would go out for a short while, and then come back right away. She smiled and said that he could go. The Duchess, in turn, was glad that her son at least behaved decently in public. Some time later, the young man was running across the meadow, but a moment later, he fell to the ground with a crash and sighed heavily. He was glad that he could finally be in silence. He was able to escape from the hustle and bustle. But a moment later, he flinched as he felt a strange sensation. He grew up in love and care, so he never smelled blood. But his instincts were above that. He thought that he should still go back quickly. But suddenly he heard a noise behind him. He was very afraid to turn around, but his curiosity got the better of him. A moment later, turning around, he saw a terrible silhouette towering over him. He was so shocked that he lost his speech. The young man was trembling with fear because he did not know what was in front of him. A moment later, he realized that it was Luc Bichel in front of him. He wondered if she had killed someone. The young man saw her terrible black wings. He had never been afraid of anything in his life. This time, he began to fear man from the first meeting. He fell to the ground unconscious. Bastian in turn slept peacefully and carefree in his bed. Opening his eyes, he saw his mother. The Duchess looked at him, puzzled, and said that she was very worried. He asked in bewilderment where he was. The Duchess said that he was in one of the rooms of the palace. The Duchess said he had fainted, and Luc Bichel brought him to them. The young man was shocked by what he heard. The mention of the young lady made him vomit. The Duchess was shocked as she did not expect such a thing. She shouted for a doctor to be called. The Duchess asked the doctor if her son was all right, as he had fainted and possibly hit his head. The doctor said he was fine and mentioned Luc Bichel, and at the same time Bastian felt sick. The doctor looked at the boy and asked if he had a mental disorder. The Duchess looked at him in bewilderment. The doctor said the boy might have had a shock at some point. The Duchess said she didn't think so. The Duchess thought for a moment about the strange reaction that came after certain words. The doctor said that her boy was still weak, but still there was no need to worry, as he would take care of him. The Duchess said that the doctor need not worry, and that she would take care of her son herself. The Duchess said that her son has a difficult character and does not like strangers. The Duchess sent the doctor out and sighed heavily. She was glad that she was able to be alone with her son. The Duchess came closer to her son and told him to tell her the truth now. She came closer to him and asked if he was scared. The young man hesitated, embarrassed, and didn't know what to answer. A moment later, looking at his mother, he said that of course he was not afraid. The Duchess said that he had not yet come to his senses. She wanted to mention the young lady again, but Bastian covered his ears with his hands and told her to stop. The Duchess said she was right looking at her son. She asked how shocked he was. Even with his eyes closed, he saw that picture. The severed head, the sound of dripping blood did not leave the boy's head. He saw Luc's deadly, terrible eyes, and the Duchess in turn stroked his head tenderly. The Duchess looked tenderly at her son and said that he seemed to have met Luc. The Duchess smiled and told her son that she did not understand what was so frightening about the young lady. The young man looked at his mother angrily, but said nothing. Looking at his mother, he said that everything was not so at all. The Duchess told her son to go and say hello to Miss Bichel. The Duchess smiled and told her son that, after all, the young lady had brought it, so he had no need to be afraid of her. The young man was furious. He did not understand what kind of grateful greeting there could be if it was she who should apologize to him. She appeared in the royal garden in an unceasing manner, and because of her, he lost consciousness. He was sure that she must beg him on her knees for forgiveness. The young man came closer to the room. He did not want to go there, but he knew that he still had to. Before Bastian could knock on the door, Luc suddenly opened the door and looked at the boy in surprise. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was okay, since his face had turned pale. She smiled and said that he must have been sweating from sleep. He was surprised. The young lady offered him a handkerchief with a smile. Bastian froze in surprise. He could not understand why she was behaving like this. He slapped her hand and asked why he should accept a handkerchief from someone like her. The young lady looked at him with bewilderment and shock, as she did not understand why he behaved in such a way. He pushed her away and told her to get out of the way, as he didn't have time. The young lady in turn fell to the ground with a crash. She stared after him. A moment later, she asked him if he didn't want to accept the ceiling from someone like her. He flinched and froze. A moment later, he turned and looked at her intently. Luc looked at him in confusion. She looked at him with her big eyes and asked what he meant when he said such a thing. Bastian stared into her violet eyes. He remembered them from last night. Looking away from her, he said that it was his mistake, and he asked her for forgiveness. Bastian picked up the handkerchief and said with a smile that he would wash it and return it. He asked what family she was from. Bastian asked the young lady what her name was. If anyone saw this spectacle, they would find it funny. The young lady looked at him and said her name was Luc Bichel. The young man looked at the young lady in shock, but a moment later he fell down in broad daylight. He fainted. The maid told the butler that he, the young master, had refused breakfast, and the butler asked what he didn't like this time. The maid said that he had not eaten anything since he visited the royal palace. She thought something had happened, but did not dare to ask. The butler thought about this for a moment. A moment later, he told the maid that they needed to go to the master. The young gentleman sat by the window and looked intently. A moment later, the butler knocked on his door. The butler greeted the gentleman and said that he had been told that he was refusing to eat. The butler asked what he didn't like. The young gentleman looked at the butler and asked if he knew Luc Bichel. Bastian said that his father told him to be friendly with her since she was a monster hunter. The butler said that not long ago, for the successful destruction of the rebellious tribes of the desert, the king granted her the title of Marquise of Lorda. Bastian sighed heavily and asked if she was really that famous. The butler said that her reputation had been growing rapidly lately. The young man asked the butler if the king's close friend was a war heroine, and the butler said that it was so. Bastian looked at him and said that he wanted to know more about her. The butler asked if he should prepare a book for the masters. The young man looked at him and told him to bring him all the books about the young lady. Several years later, the Duke entered the office in a rage and called his son. The young man smiled and told his father that he would soon break down his door. He asked his father what happened. The Duke was taken aback, for his son, as always, looked dazzling. The Duke looked at his son with a keen gaze, for he knew that now was not the time to admire his beauty. The Duke said that he had received a complaint from the Marquis of Verona. The Duke looked at his son and asked what he had done again. The young man sighed heavily and asked if he really didn't know. The Duke angrily said that he knew everything. The Duke said that because of him, the Marquis's second son was walking around the streets, naked, and he ran and cried, not knowing what to do. Bastian sighed heavily and said that it was not his fault, that the young man did not want to give him back the money he borrowed from him. Bastian said the boy crossed the line when he asked him for money to gamble. Bastian said that he clearly remembers that the young man promised to return him 5 times more. Bastian said he just wanted his money back. The Duke angrily asked his son if he had really given money to that madman. A moment later, the Duke asked his son what his schedule was today, as his mother wanted to see him. The young man said that he would like to meet his mother, but he had plans today, as he was going to meet Her Majesty. The Duke frowned and asked if the day of the meeting with Her Majesty had really arrived. In this kingdom, the successor of the Duke was obliged to visit the palace once a month, and on that day he was supposed to hear good news. Queen Christina looked at Bastian with a smile and greeted him. In turn, he politely greeted the Queen and said with a smile that he was glad to see her in good health. The Queen smiled and said that she was also very glad to see him. The young man, looking at the Queen, asked with a smile what she would say to this. She smiled and said that she liked his persistence, but he had become a bit quiet lately. Bastian asked if she didn't like it. The Queen said that a lion remains a lion, even if he hides his claws. He looked at her and said with a smile that she looked as if she wanted to tell him something. The Queen, looking at him, said that a request had been received to marry him. The young man was dumbfounded with shock. The Queen said the offer came from Bruno's family and asked if he knew Bella Bruno. The young man said, puzzled, that he knew her, but most likely it was her parents who wanted this marriage, not her. The Queen said that all noble marriages were like that, since even she married because of her parents. The young man smiled and said that they must be completely out of their minds. He asked what to do if he had already taken the oath. The Queen was shocked, looked at him, and asked if he was already engaged. He said he didn't say it was an engagement. The Queen asked in bewilderment, since that didn't help, then what Bastian thought for a moment. A moment later, he said it was a promise, with a smile on his face. The Queen looked at his radiant smile and said that she could see that he was up to something. She said that his reaction was very funny, but such an oath would be difficult to prove, and the Count personally asked for it. The Queen said that the Count said he wanted to hear his opinion. The young man frowned and asked if his father knew about it. The Queen said she had not told him about it, but Count Bruno was not a bad man, and perhaps his father already knew about it. Bastian said that it was time for him to go, and he was forced to leave her. The Queen asked in bewilderment if he really had any work. Bastian gave the queen a beaming smile and said that it was very important since he was going to get married. He was riding in a carriage and passed by the garden where he first met Luc Bichel. Bastian, in turn, recalled their meeting and considered his further actions, thinking about the young lady. The butler asked the gentleman where they were going. The young man said that they were going to see his father. Bastian said he needed to tell his father that he was going to propose to Luc Bichel. Bastian looked at his father and told him to stop already. The Duke jumped up in anger and asked his son when he had said that he was going to marry him to Luc Bichel. The young man smiled and said that he expected such a reaction. He asked his father if he wanted to say anything else. Bastian looked at the butler and asked if Gould had brought what he asked him to. Gould sighed heavily, knowing that the slacker was doing whatever he wanted again. A moment later, he handed him the diary. Bastian read the interesting story in the diary with a smile. He said that he had not eaten anything, and that was because he had no appetite. But his father said that Luke ate 5 times. Duke was shocked. Gould, in turn, sighed his expression, saying that he did not know the young master. Bastian, you read about how he got angry and broke the dishes, after which his father said that at this rate he was only bringing the wedding closer. The Duke looked at his son with puzzlement and told him to stop. Looking at the diary, the young gentleman said that every time he said something, his father threatened him with marriage. The young man looked at his father and said that he said he needed proof. Bastian said with a smile that it was time to fulfill his promise. The Duke sighed heavily. He was in shock as he had just realized what he had done. The young man smiled and told his father that he had predicted the marriage of his beloved son in advance. Bastian looked at his father with a satisfied smile and said that he was leaving. The Duke looked at him with bewilderment and asked where he was going. Bastian smiled and said that he was a responsible child who listened to his parent, and he was going to make an offer. Lord a territory located on the outskirts of the kingdom, Luke destroyed the tribe of the shaman in the northern desert. As a result, the queen granted her these lands. 12 years have passed since she became the ruler. Most of the shamans have disappeared from those places. Since the monsters they created weren't going anywhere, she continued to fight, and then rumors began to spread. Many laughed at her for being a half-breed. They thought she was unworthy of everything she received. The kingdom's strongest mage won the title on her own. Miranda looked at the lady and said that she should rest as she already had circles under her eyes. Miranda smiled and said that the lady had brought a snack, and her favorite was milk pudding. Miranda said she should drink the tea, as the carefully selected leaves for the drink would fill her with energy. The young lady thanked her with a smile and said that they would definitely have some tea. Miranda froze in place, staring intently at her mistress. Miranda thought her mistress was very nice after all. Deep violet eyes, snow-white skin, she was a beautiful lady and very strong. Miranda's loyalty grew stronger day by day. Looking at her mistress, she said that in this world, there was no one more amazing than her. Miranda said she needed to rest more often. Luke said she needed to see the list of people she needed to meet with. Miranda looked at the lady and said that she was trying too hard. Miranda said that Luard needed her, and she still needed to take care of herself. A moment later, the young lady thanked her with a smile for her kind words. The maid Ellie Klein ran into the office and called for the mistress in a hurry. The young lady asked what had happened. The young lady looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she meant. Ellie said that he had come to propose to her. Luke asked if Constantine Sienna had come again. Ellie would say, using the fact that the beta didn't even mention those awful potatoes. Luke said that she turned him down because he wasn't her type. Luke asked who came to them then, if it wasn't Constantine. Ellie said it was Bastian Effenberg Luke. You in turn were in shock. A few minutes later, she asked who came. The maid asked if she had never heard of the young Duke, and the young lady said that she had. The maid said that she had never seen anyone so beautiful. She said he was a handsome blonde, with eyes like precious stones. Ellie said that he was handsome from any side. You looked at him. His features were perfect, and even his voice was beautiful. The maid said with admiration that Bastian was simply like a work of art. Ellen said that she could not go and disgrace her mistress in front of such a highly respected person. The maid said that her mistress could not meet him like that. The young lady was perplexed and did not understand what had come over the maid. Luke was puzzled that they wanted to propose to her. Philippa greeted the Marquise with a smile and said that she had been waiting for this day for a long time. Philippa told the Marquise that she had not expected her to visit her, as she had thought that she would go straight to Bastian. The young lady asked if changing clothes now would be disrespectful. Philippa said that, of course it wasn't, and she would make her shine the brightest. Philippa said that since her guest was Sir Bastian himself, that changed everything. Philippa told the maids to prepare themselves, as they had to highlight all the virtues of the young lady. A few minutes later, they were actively preparing the young lady for the meeting. The young lady called Philippa. Madame smiled and told the Marquise that she was listening to her. Luke asked her if she didn't like Sir Bastian. Philippa was shaking with anger. She said that this guy was a real demon incarnate. The young lady looked at her in bewilderment. She was shocked by such a reaction. Philippa, in turn, could barely contain herself. Philippa said angrily that many years had passed since then. The young lady asked her to calm down. Philippa said that she once ran a good boutique in the very center of the capital, and one day the Duchess visited her and invited her to her estate. Philippa said furiously that she never imagined that her masterpiece would be treated in such a terrible way. Of course, the situation was somewhat exaggerated in Philip's perception. Philippa said furiously that she spent several weeks making that suit, and he simply burned it without even trying it on. Philippa said that if the young lady had not given her a job, she would not know what to do now. Luke smiled and told Philippa that it was all in the past and asked her to forget about it. The young lady said with a soft smile that it was thanks to the young man that they met. Philippa was touched by the young lady's words and said that she would do everything possible to make her look perfect today. Miranda looked at her mistress puzzled and worried and called her Miranda looked at her in surprise and said that she looked absolutely delightful today. Miranda looked at the lady in surprise and asked if she was really going to agree to the proposal. Luke said with a smile that the most famous aristocrat in the kingdom had come to propose to her, and it was quite interesting. Miranda told the lady that she should not agree, and she would prefer Sienna instead. Miranda said that Constantine is from a family of marquises, and that he is not such a bad knight. Miranda said that they met often and knew each other well. Miranda looked at the lady and said that she shouldn't explain it to her like that. The young lady sighed heavily and said that Constantine was ugly and she didn't like him. The young lady smiled and said that she was joking and that she couldn't keep the guest waiting long now. Luke in turn froze, looking at the door. She knew that he was sitting behind it. A moment later, she plucked up her courage and entered the room. The young man looked at her and said that he had been waiting for a long time. She looked at him in bewilderment. The young lady stared at the young man, frozen in surprise. A moment later, she greeted him according to all the rules of etiquette. He sighed heavily and said that he knew what she wanted to talk about, that she shouldn't be so polite. The young lady understood that the young man had not changed at all, although she knew that now everything was a little better. She looked at him intently and said that she had been informed that he had arrived on some business. Bastian looked at her and asked if they hadn't told her what specific business he had come for. Luke looked at him as he came too suddenly, which stunned her. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she had heard about his desire to propose to her. Bastian looked at her intently and said seriously that it was all true. She looked at him in surprise and said that she didn't understand him. He asked in surprise what she was talking about. The young lady said she did not understand why he had decided to take this step, and rising from the sofa, he asked if she was really interested in the reason. He came closer to her and looked at her intently. She occasionally remembered the day when they first met. The young lady was taken aback because he was too handsome, and she thought it was illegal. Bastian looked at her intently and asked if he really needed a reason when a man wanted to propose. The young man looked intently at the young lady and called her softly. She looked at him in surprise as she was waiting for an answer to her question. He kissed her hand tenderly and softly told her that he loved her. Without looking up, he asked her to marry him with a soft smile. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she agreed. Bastian in turn looked at her in surprise. Bastian asked in surprise what she just said. He was shocked as he didn't expect her to agree so quickly. The young lady looked at him with a smile and said that she agreed. After a while, they sat and looked at each other in silence. Bastian froze. He was surprised and could not say anything. Bastian had soft sapphire eyes under long lashes, and he was taller than she expected. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really liked him. The young lady, looking at him, calmly said that everything was exactly like that. A moment later, she was taken aback, as she did not expect to answer him so directly. Looking at her, he said with a smile that this was still a good start. The young lady frowned. He smiled and said that being satisfied with your spouse's appearance is the first step to a happy marriage. He said that she also looks beautiful. Luke looked at him and said that he was a liar, because both times they met. He fainted, he jumped up. The young lady looked at him intently and said that there was nothing to worry about. She looked at him intently and said that she reacted to her like that when she first saw hers. Bastian calmed down and said that even if it was unpleasant, he was very glad that she accepted his offer. He said that he heard that the Marquis's second son had beaten him to it, and so he was afraid that she would refuse him, so he planned to give in. He said he was afraid she would refuse to marry someone she didn't know, and Luke asked in bewilderment what he meant by that. She said that they had already met twice, and he asked in bewilderment when that was. The young man sighed heavily and said that today was their first meeting. The young lady asked him in bewilderment why he thought so, and he said it was because he was ashamed. She agreed with him, but she could see that his face didn't tell the truth. She asked if they could discuss the details, and also suggested that he take a walk and look around the castle. Some time later, they were leisurely strolling around the castle grounds. A gentle breeze swept around her, and she said with a smile that she hoped he was as comfortable as she was. The young man watched her intently, and a moment later he called out to her. He came closer to her and took her hand. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment. He smiled a tender smile and asked if he could kiss her. The young lady looked at him intently and refused him. Bastian was stunned by the refusal, as he did not expect such a thing. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that it meant she was not always ready to agree. Looking at the beautiful young lady, he said that he hoped they would get closer as soon as possible. Luke, in turn, knew that he was an aristocrat. To the core, his nobility and appearance were everything one could only dream of. She saw that there was not a single flaw in him, but she still wondered why he decided to ask for her hand. Miranda came closer to them and asked if they were finished. Luke looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The young lady asked Miranda if she had been waiting for them. Miranda bowed and said that it was true. Luke looked at Miranda and said that in that case, she could meet Bastian. Luke said that Miranda was helping her run her business. Miranda was a little surprised, as she knew that after Constantine proposed to his mistress, he left with swollen eyes. Miranda saw that the man was in a normal state and was glaring at her menacingly. Miranda was puzzled because she knew this was not good. Luke told Miranda to prepare one room. Luke said that the young man would stay with them for a few days. Miranda looked at her in surprise and asked if he would really stay. The young lady smiled and said that it was so he would soon become the husband of the Marquise, and he could not be avoided. The young man smiled and said that he was a little late in greeting. He said that his name was Bastian Effenberg. He said with a radiant smile that he was her mistress's future husband. Miranda looked at him in shock. Ellis was a servant of the castle of Lord. She was responsible for cleanliness and order. Near the mistress, she had a very important task today. She knocked on the door and, opening it, greeted the gentleman. She smiled and introduced herself and said that she would take him to his room. She said that he could ask her anything. He looked at her intently and said that he had hopes for her, and also said that he thought he was going to die while he was waiting for her. The young lady was a little puzzled, as this was not how she had imagined him. As she walked down the corridor with him, she thought that such comments did not matter. Ellie looked sideways at the young man. She couldn't believe that he was the future owner of the house. He is not only handsome, but also tall, and he was the heir to the Eastern lands. He is the Queen's cousin, and Ellie knew that, if her mistress married him, she would become a Duchess. She knew it was excellent, and hoped that the lady's path would be paved with gold. She knew that everyone who looked down on the lady could now take care of themselves. Bastian walked up to the bed and asked if it was Luke who had slept there. A moment later, he plopped down on the bed. The maid looked at him in bewilderment. She was in shock and did not understand what she had just seen, since he did not behave as she had imagined. The young man opened the window and said with a joyful smile that she was admiring the view. He picked up a teaspoon and said with admiration that it was the one Luke herself had used. Ellie gave him a puzzled look and said that it wasn't so. She was shocked by his behavior. She said that their estate was on the border, but still they would not allow a guest to use the same things as the lady. He threw away the spoon and said that everything looked miserable and that he was very sorry. Ellie was in shock. She didn't understand that she looked pathetic. She was angry at him for saying such words. Bastian approached the maid and said that he had been told that the Marquise had earned a lot of money. He asked what it was spent on. Ellie said with a smile that her mistress was not a greedy person. She invested a lot of money in the development of Lordy. He sighed heavily and said that it sounded too sweet and that one shouldn't only care about others. The maid was in shock. Her patience was bursting at the seams. She could barely contain herself. Now she realized that all she could do was admit that she had been very wrong from the start. She knew that he could not allow him to see his mistress. She said that she could endure anything but not an insult to the mistress. He asked with a grin what she would do to him. Bastian did not see an opponent in front of him. She said furiously that she could make him disappear. She knew she could do it without any difficulty. The young man, in turn, saw bright orange eyes and pointed ears, and he wondered if she belonged to a different race. He understood that, judging by her appearance, she was a descendant of the Kurt assassin tribe, but he still knew that it didn't matter. He said it was funny. He asked her if she knew what the first thing he would do was become her mistress's husband. Ellie gritted her teeth and glared at him. She was furious and waiting for him to say something. The young man looked at her intently and said with a grin that he would appoint her as his personal servant. She was shocked because she knew she would go gray if she served him. She wanted to be fired immediately. A moment later, she fell to her knees and said she was wrong. She begged him not to do such a thing. He came closer to her and tapped her on the shoulder. Bastian said with a fierce grin that he was offering her to be friends. He asked what she thought about it. Ellie was in shock and burst into tears. She understood that she was finished. The young man smiled and said that his things were already unpacked, and now it was time for him to visit his beautiful bride. Ellie said that she was at the training ground because she had to supervise the recruits personally. The young man looked at her in surprise for a moment and frowned. He said that he couldn't skip training because it was impolite. He approached the knight and asked if there was a place from which he could see the field where they were training. The knight said that there was a place, and also greeted the gentleman and introduced himself. Arthur said that the training ground was clearly visible from the second floor of the watchtower. Bastian said that he understood. Bastian called the maid and told her to follow him. Ellie obediently agreed. She was puzzled and wondered what the point was, since he had not gone to the landing, but had decided to go to the tower. The knights in turn greeted Sir Ginzel with all courtesy. Arthur looked at the knights and asked what the situation was on the border now. The knights said that everything was fine and looked timidly at the young man. And asking for forgiveness, they asked who was with him, since they had never seen him alone before. Arthur, sighing heavily, said that if nothing changed, he would become the mistress's husband. He said to treat him with respect. The knights were shocked. They looked at the young man and asked Arthur if he was really joking. Arthur looked at the Marquise and said that it seemed she had decided to personally train the recruits. The young man looked intently at the Marquise. He saw her beautiful smile. He, looking at the young lady with a grin, said that this was senseless zeal on her part. A moment later, he looked closely and froze. He saw her looking straight up, and their eyes met for a few minutes. Bastian, in turn, looked closely at his future wife and saw wings behind her back. He was shocked to see the wings. He remembered their first meeting and shuddered. He closed his eyes, sickened by what he saw, his memories flooding back. He told himself that he needed to pull himself together because he was no longer a child, and he couldn't lose face in front of the crowd. Arthur looked at him in surprise and asked if he was okay. Bastian said with a grin that he was okay. A moment later, the Marquise flew up to her future husband, surprised that he was watching her. Bastian froze in surprise as he looked at the beautiful lady. He was glad that she didn't notice anything. He asked if she could remove her wings. Bastian said he thought they were tearing her clothes. The young lady sighed heavily and said that this had happened before. She said that he had seen them before, although she had little control over her body then. Bastian froze in surprise as he turned out to be more timid than expected. The young lady came closer to him and called him as she saw his anxious state. She screamed at him to hold on because she couldn't lose consciousness again. He flinched at her words. A moment later, he covered her mouth with his palm, and the young lady froze in bewilderment. He came closer to her and asked with a grin when this happened. She didn't answer. He asked again with a fierce grin. When this had happened, she mumbled something. Bastian looked at her and said that this was the answer Ellie called her mistress. Ellie and Arthur looked at the young man with anger and wariness. Ellie told the lady that the beta had only ordered, and they would gladly kill him. Luke was told by the maid that it was not allowed to do, that he asked why it was not allowed, and also said that it would leave no traces. Luke smiled and told her to calm down since he was her future husband. Arthur said that if nothing unexpected happened, he would still stay. Bastian came closer to him and asked him angrily why he kept saying such things. Arthur looked at him and said that it was because nothing had been decided. Yet Bastian said that the main thing was that they both agreed. Arthur said that Loard is a land granted personally by the Queen. Although the Marchioness does not have much influence, she still holds a noble title. Arthur looked at the young man and asked if the Duke approved of this marriage. Bastian did not expect the question. A moment later, he asked with a grin if this detail was really that important. Ellie asked him angrily what he was saying, because she could see that he was simply crazy. Arthur asked if it wouldn't be a good idea to send a letter to the Duke's family. He said it was necessary to make it clear that they were not involved in this. The young ladies asked in bewilderment why this should be done. Arthur said that he was the future Duke and could not marry just on a whim. Bastian looked at his future wife and told her not to listen as it was not important. The young lady was puzzled. She said that she almost became the main character of this madness, and they were just trying to fool her. Bastian asked angrily who she took him for. He said that he had something prepared for this occasion. He came closer to me and opened the box, which contained a ring. She asked in bewilderment what it was. The young man knelt before her and waited intently for an answer. Ellie was in shock. Luke froze and stared at the beautiful ring he presented to her. Everyone present shouted at her not to accept the ring. She smiled and said that she had already done everything. Arthur was shocked, as he was sure that it was a family treasure. The young man said with a fierce grin that now everything was decided, and from now on they were connected. Luke looked closely at the ring and said that it didn't suit her. Somehow she asked if she could take it off. Bastian was shocked. A moment later, the Marquise heard a noise. She said that they had a guest now, but she had received no warning of his arrival. Looking at everyone present, she said that no matter what, this was a very important visitor, and he needed to be met. The young lady asked everyone present to take care of her future husband. The young man was surprised, as the young lady's expression suddenly changed. He thought for a moment, because when he grabbed her, she seemed very fragile to him. He knew little about the young, beautiful lady, but he wanted to learn more and talk to her more. He genuinely wanted to spend a lot of time together because he wanted to know her true nature. Ellie smiled with mischievous anticipation and said that maybe compared to his territory, their territory was the size of a palm. But even here there was something to look at. She told him to trust her, that he would not be disappointed. He sighed heavily and said in a puzzled tone that he had been waiting for this for a long time. Ellie looked at him with fury as he was annoying her. Bastian said that they could see what was on this palm. Ellen asked that even if she called her, that could he stop. He asked what kind of building it was, since it would fall apart when touched. She said that the castle staff lived there. Bastian didn't understand how one could live in such a place. Ellie said that in the center, there was a dining room next to the kitchen, and opposite was a waiting room for the staff. He said that she was interrupting him, and he could see that she was simply burning with desire to become his personal servant. She looked at him and asked what place he wanted to visit. He said with a grin that he would think about it a moment later. He said that he wanted to go to where his future wife was. Arthur said that it was simply impossible. The young man looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really been here all this time. Arthur said that the Marquise was having a reception now, and she said that she would come here as soon as her meeting was over. The young man told Arthur that his hearing was fine, and he understood everything perfectly. He said that his future wife said that he could go wherever he wanted except for her personal territory. He said he didn't know what was meant by personal space. He asked if the living room was considered that. Arthur looked at the young man intently and asked for forgiveness for the mistake he had made. Arthur asked permission to take him wherever he wanted. Bastian quietly listened to the conversation behind the door. He asked Arthur if Bella Bruno was really there. Arthur asked with surprise how he knew that Bastian said with a grin that he was smart with his mother. Arthur approached the young man and told him to take care of his reputation. Bastian said that he would tell them. Arthur asked with bewilderment what he wanted to tell them. Bastian pressed himself closer to the door and said that he didn't have it. Ellie lines because she knew that he truly had collected all the best in himself. Bastian caught a glimpse of their conversation. He heard a squeaky voice and realized that it was definitely Bella Bruno. Bastian walked away from the door in confusion as he heard his Nanette named Lucretia Arthur came closer to him in bewilderment and asked what was the matter. The young man looked at the knight with bewilderment and asked if Luke was his real name. Arthur said he was right. Bastian asked angrily why she called her Lucretia. He was confused. Arthur sighed in surprise and confusion as he realized that he needed to explain everything. He said that the lady is the knight of Duke Bruno's daughter. During her knighting, she swore an oath of allegiance to Lady Bella. Arthur said that they had a special relationship. Bastian was shocked by what he heard. He shouted that this would not happen again. A moment later, he opened the door and burst into the room. He called his beloved Lucretia. With an embarrassed smile, he said that he missed her so much that he could not wait any longer. A moment later, they sat in silence, looking at each other, Luke in shock at everything that had happened. Bella looked at the young man angrily and said that she had been thinking about him for a long time. Bastian looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she was thinking about him. Luke was shocked. She wondered why she sat between them, as she could see that the situation was very tense. Bastian sighed heavily as he looked at the young lady, Bella Bruno, the second daughter of Duke Bruno, one of the two leading families in the kingdom. So it was obvious that his father and the Duke were on good terms. It is not surprising that they decided to bring their beloved children together, but when they thought about it, they both felt sick. Bella was furious because she knew he was a real psycho. She found out when they first met at school. She wondered if he really thought of imposing himself on her friend. Bastian, in turn, knew that the first daughter of the Bruno family had gone to study in the Empire. The third had become a nun and had told him not to look for her. He wondered why this particular one was sitting in front of him now. Did she really want to marry him? The young man looked at her and said with a grin that it was time for her to disappear. He said that if she disappeared now, then he would forgive her everything in memory of their useless friendship. She jumped up in anger and asked if he was really crazy. She asked if he really wanted to marry Lucretia. Bastian looked at her with a grin and said that everything was right. Bella said furiously that he would just talk nonsense. She could not allow her beloved Lucretia to marry him. He smiled and said that he couldn't lie. He asked if she had forgotten what a sensitive nature he was. Bella was furious. A moment later, the young man looked intently at his future wife. He looked at her and said that he came because he could not stand it. Luke looked at him in confusion and asked what he was talking about. A moment later, he came closer to her and said that he was eager to see her. She froze in bewilderment. Bella hit the table with fury. Bella looked at her friend and told her to look at him because he was a real psychopath. Bastian looked at her in bewilderment and asked if she thought that if he were one, he would have come to this lord. He kissed her hand with a smile and said that he did it only because he was crazy about the young lady. He looked at her hand and noticed that she did not take off the ring. Bella said with fury that she had just seen a dirty grin on his face. He asked in bewilderment why she was looking at his face. Luke looked at them and told them to stop their frolicking. Luke looked at Bastian and said that Bella Bruno was a very dear person to her and asked him to be more polite with her. The boy looked at her with bewilderment and asked even if she had low standards. Why Bella? Bella yelled at him with fury and indignation to watch his words. Luke sighed heavily and said that they were both important guests and they needed to get along. Bella looked at her friend in shock. She asked if she really wanted them to get along. The voice asked her friend if she really agreed to marry him so that they wouldn't get married. Bella, looking at the young man, asked her friend if it was because she said that she would jump into the sea if she married him. Bastian froze in shock. He looked at them and asked what she was talking about. Bella said that marriages between aristocrats are always between families, so she told her friend that she would rather die than marry him. He asked her in bewilderment what the matter was. Bella looked at him puzzled and asked if his pot was really not cooking. Bella said that Luke had simply decided to marry him instead of her. The realization that it was all a pretense washed over Bastian. He had been wondering why she had agreed so easily, and now he understood everything. Luke Bichel is known throughout the kingdom. She has earned recognition and achieved great success. The young man was in shock, but he knew that now was not the time to rest, since he still had the advantage. The tidal mountains of money, and most importantly, perfect appearance, he wondered what could be even better. He had always been honest with himself, and now he realized that he could not give her as much as he had previously thought. He wondered what if it was true, and she had decided to marry him because of her friend. He wondered what else he was supposed to think about now, other than this. He knew that he still had to marry her. The young lady looked at one of those present and said that everything was not so at all. Bella said furiously that she wasn't interested in marriage. She said that Luke had rejected the offer of Constantine, with whom she was so close. Luke shouted that friendship was not a reason for marriage, since he was a friend to her. A moment later, she sighed heavily and said that she had a perfect example of this. Before her eyes, the young people looked at each other. Bastian and Bella couldn't stand each other. They wanted to tear each other to pieces. The young lady looked at them and asked that if friendship was a good reason, then wouldn't Bella be the best candidate for him? After all, she is his closest friend. Bella froze in confusion when less than a minute later, she said that she hadn't thought of it right away. A moment later, frowning, she asked why Luke didn't marry her. Bastian was shocked by such a question. He looked at his friend and asked what she was even talking about. Bella looked at her friend and said with a smile that she would take care of her better than anyone. Bella said that she was superior to him in everything. Bastian looked at her and told her to stop. He also asked what kind of nonsense she was talking about. He asked with a grin how she was better than him, since he knew that no one could surpass him. Bastian asked family appearance wealth in what exactly is she superior to him. The young lady said with a smirk that she didn't know about all of this that he listed, but as a person, she was clearly better than him. Luke knew there was no arguing with that, and her friend made some ironclad arguments. Luke said that, although that was true, they couldn't do something like that. She looked at her friend and thanked her for such wonderful offers, but she still had to refuse. Bella asked in surprise why she refused. Luke said she had this weird dream of marrying a handsome man. She told her friend she was missing the first point. Bella was surprised to hear she wasn't that ugly. Luke said that on the second point, she still wants to give birth to one son and two daughters, and this is her second dream. Bella said that she can just adopt them. Luke said that this will not happen. Bastian looked at his bride in surprise and asked if she really loved children. Bastian said with a smile that she should not worry. Even if it was 3 or 4, he was completely confident in himself, and he was ready right now, since he had already said that he was confident not only in his beautiful appearance, but also in his strength. Bella shouted furiously that this was not possible. She said that her friend could choose anyone, and even Constantine was better than him. Bastian angrily asked Bella how she dared compare him to some Constantine, and even offer Constantine to his beloved Lucretia. Luke called Bastian and said she wanted to talk about the words he added to her name. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked if she was talking about his beloved Lucretia. She looked away from him and said that when she heard words like that, it made her a little embarrassed. Bastian froze in bewilderment, but inside he was burning with embarrassment and was ready to explode. He was shocked and couldn't believe that she was embarrassed, the best magician in the whole kingdom, the queen's best knight. She could be called many things, but there was no word that could describe how sweet she was now. Bella looked at Bastian with fury and his embarrassed face and asked what was wrong with him. He was in shock as he blushed deeply. Bella asked him furiously if he really loved Lucretia. Luke, looking at the young man, said that she wanted to ask about it. Bastian looked at her with bewilderment and asked what she wanted to know. Luke, what he had said earlier, that he loved her. He looked at her and with a radiant smile said that he loved her even more than she thought. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked why. He said he fell in love with her at first sight. She looked at him and said he would tell others that, because she knew he almost kicked the bucket at first sight. He sighed heavily and said that it was then and a long time ago. He said it was because he liked her too much. A moment later, the room was dead silent. No one said a word. Bella screamed furiously at him to stop talking. She knew this couldn't be allowed. Bella looked at her friend and said that she was the best one to marry him. She told her friend not to worry about anything, and she would solve everything. Luke started to calm his friend down and said that she didn't mind. Bella yelled at her friend not to worry, and she would figure it out. A moment later, she ran out of the room. Luke sighed heavily and said that she completely forgot that Bella liked to do and then think. Luke looked at the young man and said that they needed to go to the capital immediately. Through the portal, the young man looked at her in confusion and asked what she meant. The young lady said that if Bella wanted something, she would go all the way until she got her way, and given her departure, there would soon be another marriage proposal in the Duke's family. The young lady said that before that happened, they had to get ahead of her. The young lady looked at her companion and asked if he could not do this. She said that she understood his feelings and that he did not need to accompany her at all. The young man looked at her and said that he was going, and that was his firm decision. The young lady asked in surprise if it was true. Bastian said that he did not know what kind of misconception she had about him, but he was quite capable of going. She looked at him and said she didn't think it was a delusion. A moment later, he said with confidence that they should go approaching the portal. He froze. He asked how it worked. The young lady said that for this, she needed my magic. She asked him to turn away for 1 minute. The young man froze, and suddenly he heard the rustle of wings. He froze and looked away. The young man was furious because his body had gained weight on its own. He was in shock and didn't understand why this was happening without his will. He wondered why he couldn't just open his eyes and look at her. The young lady looked at him and told him to follow her. She said it wouldn't be long, so he had to try not to open his eyes. So much time had passed, but nothing had changed. She picked him up in her arms, and they rushed into the portal. The knight approached the Duke and said that he had visitors. The Duke looked at him in bewilderment. The Duke looked at the knight and asked what visitors he was talking about. The knight in turn hesitated, but a moment later said that the young master and Luc Bichel had arrived to see the Duke. The Duke froze in shock. He thought that his son was a complete idiot. A moment later, they were sitting in the living room, eating, the atmosphere very tense. The Duke sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady, said that it seemed his son had caused her a lot of trouble. The young lady said with a smile that she was not sure they understood what he was talking about. The Duke, looking at his son, said that he meant that he knew his son and could imagine how tiresome and tedious his antics were. The young lady smiled and said that she did not think he was tiresome and tedious. She said that on the contrary, he came to propose to her. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he was very sorry for taking up her time, as he knew that she was a very busy lady. A moment later, the Duke looked at her in bewilderment and asked what was on her finger. She looked at him in bewilderment and said that she did not understand what exactly it was. The Duke shouted furiously that the ring on her finger was a family heirloom. The young lady stood dumbfounded, but a moment later she said that she knew about it. She said with a soft smile that she was flattered because it was so beautiful and elegant. The Duke looked at her and asked permission to clarify one thing. He asked if she had accepted his proposal. The young lady said sharply that of course she had accepted it. The Duke, gritting his teeth, said that they must break off the engagement, and she gave him a stern look and said that she would not even think of doing so. The Duke, in his fury, said that he had already made an agreement with the daughter of Bruno's family. The young lady said that her agreement had been made earlier. The young lady said that Her Majesty had long ago promised her that she could choose any man she liked as her groom. Luke said that his lordship may be Her Majesty's uncle, or the ruler of the kingdom, but she doubted that he could disobey her order. The young lady dealt him a fatal blow. Bastian, in turn, was simply shocked by his future wife. He saw that she was simply a delightful person. He knew that she was simply incredible. The young man said that his father was a duke, the great ruler of the eastern region of the kingdom, but he valued anyone's honor very much, so there was no need to worry about it. What in turn froze in shock. He could not believe that his own son was doing this to him. The Duke looked at the Marquise and asked her to refuse this offer. He said that if she wanted, he could offer her a much better marriage. He asked her what about Constantine of Siena. Bastian asked his father how he could compare this beast Constantine with him. He said that he was disappointed in his sense of beauty. The Duke angrily asked whom he called a beast. The Duke told his son that all he had was his good looks. The Duke said he was ashamed of his son. The young man asked his father if he hadn't given him his beautiful face. He said it was impossible to talk to him. The young lady was shocked. The lady looked at the Duke and asked if he was against this marriage because his son had bad qualities as a ruler. She asked if there was another reason. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand what she was talking about. She asked, sighing heavily, if he really objected, because she was of mixed blood. The Duke shouted angrily that this was not entirely true. He said that in fact, Bruno's family was descended from the Carpin family. Luke looked at him in bewilderment and asked why he was against their marriage. He said that he was ashamed to talk about it, but it hurt him to realize that he lived with his son and his terrible character. The Duke said that his son was about to leave the kingdom. He said that his son was a poor man abandoned by his wife. A moment later, there was silence in the room. The young people looked at the Duke in surprise and bewilderment. The Duke said with tears in his eyes that he had raised his beloved boy incorrectly. The Duke said that eventually she would get tired of his pretty face. He said that she already knew about his sharp tongue. The Duke said that since he was his son, he would always remain a sweet boy in his father's eyes. But he didn't expect others to feel the same way. The young lady said with a pleasant smile that she found him cute too. The Duke in turn was very glad that she said such words, but a moment later he sank. He said that it was not easy, and if she got tired of him and decided to leave the kingdom, then it would be a strong blow to their pride. The young lady looked at him intently and said that they would leave him and that he had nothing to worry about after all. Bastian was embarrassed by her words, and even more embarrassed by the fact that she took his hand and looked at him tenderly. The Duke looked at her intently. He was very surprised and said that he never thought he would hear such words, since they had already decided when their wedding would take place. She said that he personally wanted it to happen as soon as possible. The Duke looked at his son with a gray expression and told him to hold his horses since his opinion did not matter here. Bastian beamed with happiness when he received his father's approval. He looked at his father with a smile and asked when he ever took his opinion into account. At that moment, something changed in the young lady's thoughts, but of course the young man did not notice it. Luc Bichel thought about Bastian Effenberg, a man who stood out in no way except for being the Duke's heir. Moreover, he became famous throughout the empire solely for his handsome face and sharp tongue, but he became Lord Bastian. In this chaotic world of aristocrats, where one or two illegitimate children hardly attract attention, it will not be difficult for her to shut him up. She knew that trust was a different matter entirely. She remembered that he had said that he loved her. The young lady thought that love was a ridiculous feeling. She knew that it was very ridiculous from the start. The heir of the Duke proposed to her. She knew that she, as an ordinary marquise, had no worthy reasons to refuse him. She thought that it was strangely different from the various battles. It all amused her a little. The Duke looked at her and said that since they were already here, they could meet his wife. The young lady asked if he wanted her to meet the Duchess. The Duke said that he did, and she would be arriving at the estate shortly. The Duke said that until then, his son could introduce her to the palace. The young lady smiled timidly and said that she was a little nervous because it was her first time in their palace. The young man smiled and said that she could believe him whatever she expected. What she was about to see would be beyond her imagination. Opening the door, they saw the maids. The servants took him into account and bowed politely to them and asked the young master how many suits he wanted to change today. The chef smiled and asked the young gentleman if he had decided what he would eat today. The chef said that they had everything he preferred. A moment later, he began to list all the exquisite dishes that the young gentleman preferred. The cook smiled and said that one word from him, and he was completely at his disposal. A moment later, they were walking to the stables. The young man smiled and told the young gentleman that his horse was being groomed as always, as luxurious as possible. The young lady looked at the horse in bewilderment, wondering if she had really seen diamonds on the horseshoes. The young man smiled and said that the people who served here definitely worked at a special level of refinement. He said that the same should be true with Luard, and he would do everything to achieve this. The young lady was surprised that he wanted to make her house look like his own. She knew that the place was absolutely nothing like this. She has a butler who listens only to her Ellie, who will do everything to prevent Bastian from bowing down. She had Philippa under her command. Luke knew she had to make sure they never clashed, and she also had a respectable earl's heir under her command. The young lady wondered if he would be able to control them. He looked at her with confusion and asked why she was looking at him like she didn't trust him. She smiled and said that she was just looking forward to seeing him in action. He smiled and said that he was in a good mood now, so he would pretend that he had not heard what she said. He thought for a moment and said that this is what he wanted to achieve. Luke looked at him in confusion, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He smiled and said that it was the first time he had achieved something on his own, and Bastian, in turn, was very proud of himself. A few minutes later, looking at the young man she called him, she said that everything he had was truly amazing. She said that he had something that ordinary people could not get, even if they worked all their lives. She smiled and said that she was born with nothing and had to work hard to achieve everything she has now. She looked at him with a hard gaze and said that she didn't want to miss this opportunity. She said that he had previously told her that he loved her very much, but still she was not one of those who believed in love at first sight. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked what exactly she was trying to say by that. She looked at him and said with a smile that when she imagined that he would belong to someone else, she didn't like it. He looked at her with bewilderment. He wondered if she was not happy to have him, but at the same time did not want him to belong to someone else. He looked at her intently and told her to continue her speech. Luke, she wants to say that from now on she will keep him with her and just look after him. She said that she will achieve her goal even if it is possible through marriage. He looked at her in surprise and asked what will happen next. The young lady froze in bewilderment, sighing heavily. She said that she had not thought it through that. Well, he asked what she meant by keeping an eye on him. Bastian was a little stunned and asked how that was possible. He shouted that he was the most handsome man in this kingdom. He said that his looks are all he has after all, which is why he puts a lot of effort into maintaining them. He asked if she didn't like his face, or if his body wasn't attractive enough. He asked if his voice was too disgusting to her. She was shocked, and said that it wasn't what he thought. She wanted to get away from him as soon as possible. Bastian looked at her with a sharp gaze and asked her to change her decision about protecting him as soon as possible. He looked at her and said seriously that he was definitely not going to just babysit her. Bastian came very close to her. The young lady was shocked. She froze in place, not even moving. He whispered quietly in her ear that he absolutely did not agree to wake up their honeymoon in Lord in this wretched old palace. He came even closer to her and said that, for this reason, it was still better to agree. The young lady was shocked as she found the scene very creepy. He said that they had talked about their first sacred night together. He asked if it shouldn't be at the best time and in the best place. He smiled and told her not to worry about it, as all she needed was to be with him. The young lady was shocked, because for a minute, she even forgot what kind of guy he really was. She even wanted to open her beautiful and magical wings to shut him up. The Duchess came closer to them and said that at last she had found them. She asked for forgiveness for keeping them waiting. The Duchess smiled and said that if she had known that they were coming to visit, she would have greeted the guests properly. The Duchess came closer to the Marquise and said with a smile that they had not seen each other for a long time. She said that, although if you think about it, they had not met since that very day, the Duchess asked, as she wished the young man was shocked since his mother mentioned that day. The young lady bowed and greeted the Duchess. She said that it had indeed been a long time. Luke told the Duchess that she hoped she had been in good health all this time. The Duchess smiled and told the young lady that she was very well trained in manners. The Duchess said, with a smile, that she heard that she accepted her son's proposal. Luke smiled and said that it was. So the Duchess looked at the young lady in bewilderment and asked why she did it. The Duchess asked her if this was really what she wanted. The Duchess asked if her son was blackmailing her. Somehow Bastian was shocked by his own mother's words. Luke said with a smile that she just couldn't refuse when she saw him. The Duchess was shocked. Bastian looked at his mother with confusion and asked why she was so worried about the young lady. The Duchess said that in any case she could imagine how difficult the journey to them was, and said that they must have been very tired. The Duchess suggested that they stay for a couple of days. Luke said that they arrived via a portal. Luke looked at the Duchess and said that unfortunately she could not be away from her lands for too long, so she planned to return soon. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that they still could not detain such a busy man. The Duchess looked at the young lady and asked why the two of them shouldn't get married since they were already here. The young lady looked at the Duchess in bewilderment, as she did not understand what she had said at all. When she first looked at the Duchess, she had a feeling of déjà vu, but now she thought that it could be. And now everything became clear to her. Her fiancé was completely similar to his mother. Luke said that she accepted her offer, but as she knew Lord Bastian had no official title, and she was still a marquise with territories under her control, although it was nothing compared to their large holdings. She said that because of this, she thought it would be more appropriate to hold the wedding on her estate. The Duchess looked closely at her son. She sighed heavily and said that she thought they had already discussed all the details. The young man said that they should have let them talk in peace first, since they had only spent half a day together. The Duchess said she thought they had already heard that she had visited Bruno's palace today. She said they were absolutely upset, and now she believes you will do something about her soon. The Duchess said she agreed with the young lady, and she is a marchioness, and their kingdom, and her son still has no title. The Duchess told the young lady to still understand what position they are in now. The young lady looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. The Duchess said that she knew that her son was mediocre, but he is also the Queen's only cousin. Milady knew that given how powerful their family was, they would have a huge number of guests, and it would be quite problematic to accommodate all of them in Lorda. The Duchess said that it was also better to have the wedding as soon as possible. She said that if it was a burden to her, then at least the paperwork should be done. The young lady asked in bewilderment if that was really possible. She said she felt the process would take at least several months. She said the Duchess was now in a desperate situation, and their refusal could seriously undermine her position. The Duchess said that if they now said that everything was predetermined and apologized, it would save her face. The young lady in turn understood that this was a very good solution to this problem. The young man looked at his mother and told his bride that he agreed with his mother. He said that he had told her from the beginning that he wanted to get married as soon as possible. He said that he would do everything in his power. The young lady looked intently at the young man. She knew that all he had was good looks. She knew that his beauty was definitely worth a lot of effort. He looked at her with a smile and said that he would do everything to make sure she had the best wedding ceremony. He asked her if she would tell him yes. The young lady was confused. Looking at the young man, she lost her common sense. A moment later, looking at him, she said with a smile that she agreed he shone brighter than the sun. Looking away from him, she said that, of course, they would return to her estate immediately after the ceremony. The Duchess said that was wonderful, and now they had decided everything. The Duchess said that for the convenience of the young lady, it was necessary for someone from her native land to come here. She said that, although they were doing everything in a hurry, a wedding was a very important event. She asked the young lady's permission to take care of the rest. The young lady thanked the Duchess with a smile. The Duchess smiled and said that her name was Hildegard, but she could just call her Hilda. Bastian looked at his mother and asked her with a smile not to invite many guests, since they would still have a second ceremony at the Marquise's estate. He came closer to his bride and said with a smile that this would be their real wedding. He asked with a smile if she was sure she wouldn't regret the first ceremony. She smiled and asked him to just give her 3 days. Miranda sighed heavily and said that Philippa was currently crying at the explosion. Ellie said it was no surprise, as her dream of having her wedding dress made for her was completely destroyed, and she asked the lady how she could have made such a decision on her own. She said that she didn't like him from the beginning. The young lady thanked her with a smile for opening the portal. Ellie frowned and said that there was nothing she could do about it. Since magic was needed to open the portal, she said that everything was fine and she wanted to wish her something. A moment later, Bastian slammed the door open and everyone stared at him in confusion. A moment later, he entered the room and said that he had barely found them. As he approached the table, he saw a lizard eating grapes. Ellie saw his scary and angry gaze directed at her. A moment later, he looked at the lizard in surprise and asked what it was. He said he was very cute. Ellie was shocked that he was hugging her. The young man looked at his bride and asked if this was her lizard. Bastian asked if he could take her for a walk. Ellie was shocked she begged the lady not to do this to her. The young lady thought about the blowing, but later said with a smile that of course he could take her. Bastian said with a smile that it was very beautiful, and called his little one Boo Boo Ellie. With her eyes told her mistress that it was unfair, and she didn't like the name he gave her. Luke in turn asked his maid for forgiveness, but she could do nothing. Bastian gathered all the servants and said that he demanded that they work off the salaries that he personally paid them. All the servants who had gathered bowed obediently and said that they were at his personal disposal. The young master said that the wedding would take place tomorrow at noon in his villa. He told them to cancel all other events immediately. Bastian said that he had already booked all the capital's boutiques in his name, so they were free to spend as much as they needed. He said that they should not skimp on anything and buy only the best. He said that even if the item was booked by someone, if it fits, then you need to buy it. Bastian looked at everyone present with a malicious grin and told them to remember that if the bills and checks differed by even a penny, they would all feel his wrath. All the servants looked at him with puzzlement, as they already knew. The butler looked at the young master and asked if he could find out who the young master would marry. Bastian, with a satisfied smile, said that it was a good question. He said yes. Who he would marry was his ideal match, Luke Bischel. All the servants present were shocked and asked if he really meant that very same marquise. Bastian looked at them and asked with anger why he had no right to marry her. He asked if there was anyone else who was worthy of him. All the servants began to whisper. They wondered if he really thought he was worthy of her. What were you talking about? She probably owed someone. But still they didn't understand what the point was for her to marry him. They said that she killed demons, protected the borders she needed to defeat the sharp tongues of the empire. They said that, in that case, God simply does not exist. The young master was very angry. He angrily hit the back of the chair. The servants trembled with fear. A moment later, they bowed obediently and told the young master that he could rely on them and they would do everything. They said they would do everything to make the wedding perfect for Luc Bichel's sake, of course. Bastian told the butler to refuse them all. Gould sighed heavily and told the master that they couldn't just refuse all the guests. The young man said that he already knew who he would invite. Bastian told the butler to send personal invitations to everyone on the list. He looked at him in surprise and asked if this was really a guest list. The butler looked at the list. The gentleman presented him with puzzlement and said that it was simply unthinkable you were on the list. Eugene Sorel, Duchess, Bruno, and Constantine Siena. The butler looked at the young master with a puzzled expression and asked if he was only inviting other people. Bastian looked at the butler with a satisfied grin. The young gentleman said with a smile that, to be honest, there were a couple of people there that he would not invite, but that would only cause more trouble. He said that he had chosen the guests carefully. The butler looked warily and with disgust at the lizard that was eating grapes. The butler sighed heavily and thought that, apparently, the master liked animals that looked like him. The butler smiled and said that he thought he had invited Eugene Sorel because he might be present at the royal palace. He asked why the others. Then the butler asked when he had managed to meet Constantine. The young man sighed heavily and said that he had not met him, but from now on he would like to. The butler said that he asked not to invite him. The young man smiled and said that if you tell him directly that Constantine was the only one he wanted to invite. Bastian asked the butler to receive him with special respect and also to make sure that he would sit in the front rows. He smiled a bright smile and said that he should of course be seated so that he could not see Luke's face. Bastian told the butler to find the perfect place so that he could not see anything, but he looked at him sharply puzzled. The butler asked the gentleman what he was even saying. Bastian asked why he needed to see his bride. He said that Constantine was his guest, and it was enough for him to see only him, since Constantine was the one who dared to send a proposal to the marquise. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she felt like vanilla pudding. The maid looked at the young lady and asked if she needed to make some dessert. Luke said that there was no need to do that, as she had already had enough sweets for today. Since early morning, she had been working without rest and preparing for the wedding. She wondered if she was being tortured, so she asked the maid if this was the last procedure. The maid looked at her in surprise and said, "Of course not." She said that, after they finished with the upper body, she should try on the dress, and then they would go back for a Thai massage. The young lady was puzzled, as this spa was recommended by her fiancé, and she had never resorted to such procedures before. The young lady looked at the maid and said with a smile that she was a master of her craft. Luke looked at her and asked if Bastian was often here. The maid tensed up. Luke looked at the maid with bewilderment, and smiling said that it was too early for her to grow old. The maid said that she didn't seem to know, but every time the young gentleman visited their salon after him, all the employees would drink themselves to death all night. The young lady asked in surprise, "Was it really that bad?" The maid cleared her throat and said that she knew she was not allowed to ask such a question, but she still had one question in mind. Looking at the young lady, she asked why she chose him. She was worried about Luke's choice. Luke said with a smile that he was very handsome and everyone present shuddered at these words. They were shocked because they understood that the Marquis had spent a lot of time in the fields and now knew no one better than him. The maid said that there were many kind and handsome men in the world. The young lady smiled and asked if they could recommend anyone to her. She knew that the owner of such a luxurious spa definitely knew more beautiful people than she did. She knew that she finally had a chance to update her hot collection. She smiled a sly smile and told the lady not to worry, as she would definitely not be disappointed. She asked what she thought of Riccardo Ende. He was the second son of the Duke and also had a bright future ahead of him. Young lady, you in turn firmly said that he is not her type. She was asked, what about Marquis Einzelbein? He is the head of the Order of the Knights of the Feminine Rose. The young lady refused. The maid said she had no other choice. She asked where her list was. A moment later, she began to show all the men on her list, but the young lady flatly refused all of them. Luke said with a smile that as she saw there really were no more handsome men in the kingdom, she smiled and said that it seemed like she had no other choice. The madam was shocked as she understood that the young duke had found his other half after all. Some time later, they nevertheless congratulated her on the upcoming ceremony. The young lady thanked them for such a pleasant reception and said that next time she would visit them with her husband. The next morning on the wedding day, the young lady stood on the porch deep in thought. Bastian noticed his bride and decided to approach her closer. He looked at her intently and called out. The young lady started as she did not expect him to come to her, but a moment later he came up to her with a changed expression. He said that she had come early. The young lady looked at him and said that she was just a little worried. He said that he understood that this was all completely unusual for her. The young lady looked intently at her fiancé, for he seemed to want to say something to her. She looked at him with a soft smile, asked him to continue his speech. She said that she saw that he wanted to tell her something. He, looking at her, timidly said that he was ashamed to talk about such things. However, he said with a smile that he hoped she would love him with all her heart. He smiled softly and said that that was all he wanted. The young lady froze, looking at her groom. After all the preparations were finished, the young lady looked in the mirror with surprise. The cats looked at her with surprise and said that she was simply beautiful. She said with surprise that now she understood why girls were so enthusiastic about wedding makeup. She said that as she thought money decides a lot, the maid smiled and said that she was just a wonderful model, and they simply could not get another result. The young lady said that the makeup was very nice, but she couldn't stop thinking about the amount of clothes she was wearing. The maid smiled and told my lady not to worry, as she was sure that the Lord was going through the same thing at the moment. The young lady smiled and said that it made her a little happy, now that she was thinking about what he had told her earlier. She remembered him looking at her and smiling softly as he said that he wanted her to love him. He said that was all he wanted. The young lady was confused and did not know what he meant when he said such words to hers. A moment later, the maid told my lady that she had a guest. The young lady looked at the maid in bewilderment, as she was not expecting anyone. The maid looked at her and said that Lord Constantine Siena had come to see her. The young lady was confused, as she had not invited him. She hoped that he had not come to make a scandal. The maid smiled and said that he would like to see her, and also asked what her decision was on this matter. The young lady sighed heavily. She wanted to talk to him later alone. After everything was settled, she didn't think anything could happen after she refused his offer. She sighed heavily and told the maid to call him. The young lady looked at Constantine and with a smile told him just not to fall in love with her. Constantine looked at her with embarrassment as his heart was ready to jump out of his chest. He looked at her in surprise and asked who she was. Luke smiled and said that she was not in the mood for such jokes. He smiled and asked if maybe he should be the one saying that he said that he had no idea that she had such a strange taste in men. The young lady looked at him with annoyance and said with a smile that they just had to respect each other's preferences. He said with fury that even if it was her preference, there had to be a reason. Constantine said that he would understand if she chose someone else. He asked with bewilderment why of all the men it was him. The young lady was shocked by such a statement. She looked at him with fury and said that it was none of his business. She did not understand why she had to justify herself to him now. He looked at her and asked with a grin who she thought had invited him. Constantine said that this arrogant goat sent him a personal invitation that he was looking forward to seeing him at the wedding. He hoped that Constantine would come. Constantine shouted with fury that it was obvious that he was mocking him. The young lady shouted angrily that he should not have come to the celebration. She said that he himself decided to respond to this provocation. She asked why he was shouting at her now. He shouted angrily for her to wake up already. As she had been fooled, the young lady froze. She asked if he was serious. A moment later, Bastian entered the room and asked who gave him the right to yell at his bride. The young men looked at him in bewilderment. Bastian said with a grin that Constantine was a guest, so he had to behave appropriately. Constantine said with a grin that he was just talking to his girlfriend. Before her ceremony, looking at Bastian, he asked what was wrong. Bastian asked with a smirk if guys who were rejected were now called friends. He said he didn't know the world had changed so much. He said that he invited him out of politeness, and in response to his behavior, he said that it was not a very polite thing to do. Bastian said that for this reason he was abandoned. Constantine angrily asked if he had finished his dialogue. Bastian approached his bride and said that, of course, he was not finished, but still he said that he was busy, and so he would stop there, since now they had to get married. Bastian told Constantine that he could enjoy the ceremony for now, and later, when he was alone, he should think about why he was rejected. Bastian said that he already had a couple of guesses. Bastian, son of the young man, and said that they would be busy both day and night, so he should not even plan meetings with Luke. Constantine, in turn, was stunned by what he heard. Sometime later, the newlyweds stood at the altar, where the wedding ceremony took place. The guests, in turn, experienced different emotions at the celebration. The Duke and Duchess cried with joy. They were very glad that their only son was marrying a beautiful girl. The young lady was a little puzzled, as there were fewer guests from her fiancé's side than she expected. But a moment later, she noticed the middle guest, Eugene Sorel. She was confused and did not know what he was doing. At the celebration, the young lady reassured herself. She thought that he probably came as a representative of the queen. She knew she had to pull herself together and focus, because this was a very important moment. A moment later, the priest, with his authority, pronounced them husband and wife. The young lady sighed heavily, as she was very tired after the ceremony. They spent ages greeting various guests. She felt very uncomfortable. She said that if all weddings were like this, then she didn't want to have another one. Bastian looked at her with a sharp gaze and said with a smile that it was a very wise decision. He said that she could just stay with him and he would guarantee her peace and happiness. He said that they would love each other until the end of their lives. He looked at her and asked if she wanted to sleep already. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and said that it was not that easy, she was very tired. Bastian looked closely at the young lady and asked if she would give him her consent. The young man looked at his wife with embarrassment. He didn't know how to start the conversation. A moment later, he said he knew she didn't like him. Bastian looked at him in surprise and said with a smile that he wasn't so terrible after all. Bastian smiled and kissed her tenderly. She shuddered in surprise. He whispered to her tenderly that if she knew what he was thinking about now, she would have a different opinion of him. He said that he understood that he had not earned her trust, but it was very important for him to say this. He said with a gentle smile that he loved her, and said it sincerely. She knew he was lying, but his voice, his touch, were gentle and pleasant. She wasn't even against being deceived in this situation. A moment after the passionate kiss, she pulled back. Bastian looked at her and asked her to give him permission. He said that she only needed to say one word. But a moment later, she covered his mouth with her hand. He looked at her in surprise. Bastian said that if this was her fetish, then he didn't mind. Luke told him to shut up, since that wasn't it. Bastian asked if something had happened. The young lady looked at him intently and asked how many people were guarding this place. He said that he did not want anyone to interfere with them, so he left the necessary part of the knights on the territory and let the rest go. The young lady thought for a moment and listened. She asked if this meant that they were all on this floor. He said with a beaming smile that of course not, and he was not that stupid, and he had done everything to make sure this floor was empty. A moment later, while he was speaking, she moved. He looked at her in surprise and called out. She said that judging by his words, there shouldn't be anyone here. He looked at her puzzledly and said that it was all correct. A moment later, the young lady opened the door. He was surprised and watched her intently. Bastian followed his wife with bewilderment. He asked her what happened. A few minutes later, the young lady closed the door in front of her husband. He knocked on the door in confusion and asked angrily what she was doing. She said that she had blocked the door of magic so that he did not need to waste his strength in vain. The young lady sighed heavily and told him to just stay in the room and not come out. She said she would be fine. He asked in surprise if she really needed to transform, but she didn't answer his question. She said that everything would be settled soon, so she asked him to trust her a little and wait in the room. A moment later, she transformed and appeared in her true form. A moment later, he turned around and walked out onto the balcony. Bastian sighed heavily and said that it happened sooner than he expected. Asking if they really had no conscience at all, he knew that the mercenaries didn't deserve to live, and with a smirk, he said that she should destroy them all. The young lady walked down the corridor in a hurry, using magic. She took out one feather from her wings. A moment later, she had her sword in her hand, looking around the room. She said she knew it was here somewhere. Looking into the distance, the young lady told the mercenary that if he wanted a fair fight, then the wise thing to do would be to just walk out. A moment later, a mercenary appeared in front of her, looking at her angrily. He saw the wings and felt her magic. The mercenary, gritting his teeth, asked if she was Luc Bichel. He said angrily that if she didn't want to die, she should move away, and a moment later, he pounced on her. In the blink of an eye, the young lady easily blocked his blow. The mercenary was in shock. He did not understand how she managed to do something like that. She turned around and struck him. She said that if that was all he could do, it would be difficult for him to harm her. He parried her blow and said with a grin that he should have said those words to her. A moment later, he saw her blazing eyes and became wary. The young lady slammed him into the wall with fury, causing a loud crash. The mercenary slid off the wall and fell to the ground with a crash. The young lady looked warily at the closed window as she felt someone behind it. She slowly approached the window. A moment later, she creaked open the window and saw a young man hanging from it. He screamed and begged for help since he was innocent. He asked her to call Bastian Effenberg and ask him for mercy. The young lady, in turn, looked at the man with bewilderment. She did not understand why he was talking about her husband and why she had to call him in particular. Bastian asked with a grin if he was really his errand boy. He asked why he had to come running to his every call. Bastian asked the man in anger how he dared to hang on his window. He pushed the window and the man fell. Bastian watched the amusing picture with a grin on his face. The young lady looked at her husband in bewilderment. A moment later, she looked at him in shock and called out to him, asking what he was doing here. Bastian, looking out the window, said that it was very strange. He was confused since there was no sound of a fall. He said that it looked like the man fell on a tree. Luke looked at him in bewilderment and asked how he managed to get out of the room. He said that a cute little lizard came and opened the door for him, and for that, he gave her 2 delicious plums. Luke was shocked, as she only now realized that her maid was in the other room. Bastian looked out of the window again and asked why there was no noise downstairs. The young man was scared and did not understand what was happening at all. He asked with tears in his eyes why he was now floating in the air. Bastian was confused, as he didn't know who it was at first, but after looking closer, he saw that it was Veron. He looked at his wife and said that it looked like she used her magic. Bastian looked at her and said that she could tie him up well, or just slam him into the wall. He asked if she really wanted to do something different with him. Luke looked at him in surprise and told him not to tell her what to do. Bastian looked at her with a soft gaze and asked if that wasn't what she was going to do. He said that knowing her, he didn't think she was going to kill him right away. The young lady was angry, as she couldn't deny it, as he seemed to know her very well. Bastian looked at his wife and said that she was too kind, since he would not care if she killed them. The young people were too angry, but did not answer. Bastian pointed at Veron and asked if there was anything she could do to him. Bastian said that he almost took his virginity, which he swore to God he was going to give to her 10 years ago. The young lady looked at her husband in shock and asked what he was talking about Bastian, so the young man first borrowed money from him and then offered to pay it back with his body. Veron asked angrily what he was thinking. Luke looked at him closely and said that he didn't look very good. The young man looked at Bastian angrily and said that he was a dirty bastard, since he sent promissory notes to his father. and because of Bastian, his father disinherited him, including lands and jewelry. Verone said that his father had even deprived him of the mansion that he had promised to give Bastian, looked at the young man, and with a grin told him not to be a fool. Bastian, if he had sold at least half of his property, would have easily covered his debts. But a moment later, he stopped as he looked at his wife, who was burning with anger. Luke came closer to the young man and asked if this was the reason he had entered the estate and was going to kill her husband. Verone looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She asked if he had not sent the killer. She said that if he had killed the creditor, he would not have had to repay the debts. The young man asked angrily what she was saying. He asked if she really thought he was going to kill Bastian, who by coincidence was the queen's only cousin. The young man said that he had come only to ask if he could repay the debt in installments. When he learned that Bastian had returned from Luard, he had made an appointment for an audience at his residence, but he had been told that he would spend some time in his villa, so he had rushed here. Bastian asked in bewilderment why he needed to climb through the window. The young man said that Bastian's men had closed all the doors to the estate, and he simply had no other choice. The mercenary looked at them and asked to kill him, rather than live in shame. Bastian came closer to him and said that it seemed he was conscious all this time. Bastian's son asked in bewilderment, "Since when can these losers make demands?" Bastian walked closer to the mercenary and asked who hired him. He didn't answer. Bastian said that he could tell his fortune himself, since it could be some people who didn't return the money they borrowed from him. Walking into the room, he began to list them all. A moment later, he turned around with a smile and asked who it could be. He asked if they were all united against him. The lady was stunned as the names he listed were very familiar to her, and she wondered how he knew them. She knew that Niger of Kalota Jaffrey, of Ilisk, and Code of Nice, all these names belonged to traitors to their kingdoms. She glared at her husband as she was furious. Luke wondered if he was funding traitors from the three kingdoms. She was shocked, as she knew he was even crazier than she thought. She looked at the young man with fury. She understood that everyone who could hear them now would be in danger. Looking at the mercenary and the young man, she knew that she'd better use her magic and put them to sleep. Bastian stopped and asked with a grin if they were going to kill him. He said that they had nothing to pay him back with, and they decided to kill him in this way. They thought that they would solve their pressing problem. He asked with a grin if they really thought that, with his death, everything would be solved. Bastian said that he couldn't even believe that these traitors were so stupid, and it wasn't surprising that they hadn't achieved any success. So far, he said that in this situation, he was also wrong because he gave them money, when it was obvious that they wouldn't give him anything back. He looked at his wife and said with a smile that that was all, and she could do with them whatever she wanted. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked what she should do with them. Bastian said that she had caught them, and it was up to her to decide what to do with them. Luke thought for a moment and said that in that case she wouldn't kill them. He looked at her and said with a smile that he still suspected that she would leave them alive. He smiled a satisfied smile and said that, as expected, she was too kind. She looked at him menacingly and said that he did not understand her at all. She looked at her husband with fury and said that she was not a peacemaker at all. She said that, in the end, she destroyed everyone who stood in her way, or in the way of the queen. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she didn't kill them now. She looked at him with fury. Bastian froze from her gaze. Goosebumps ran across his skin. She came closer to him, and with an evil smile said that it was because right now there was someone she wanted to kill more. He was stunned by her words. A moment later, the realization came to him. He asked her to have mercy on him. Luke reminded him again that it was better for him to remain silent in this situation. The young man sighed heavily and said that he was finally alone. He kissed her tenderly and said that if he was destined to die behind her back, then he was ready to accept his fate 100 times. The young lady sighed heavily and said that he kept on wagging his tongue. He smiled and said that it was true, the best moment of his miserable life. He looked at her and kissed her tender back again. He said that she was the queen's sword, the best demon hunter in the kingdom, the Marquis, and also now his wife. He hugged her tenderly and asked for permission to leave his mark on her. Bastian whispered tenderly in her ear and asked her to be his this night. The young lady was a little puzzled as she found it hard to believe that such a person who had everything could have such an empty look. She looked at him intently, and it seemed to her as if he had nothing at all. Luke knew that look very well. Luke had the same look when she was abandoned in the desert looking for water, the wind kicking up clouds of sand that flew straight into her face. This expression appeared when she thought she had lost everything, but she was still very curious and puzzled because she couldn't understand why he had such an expression on his face now. Turning around, she threw him on the bed. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect her to act like this. Luke looked at her husband with a sharp gaze and told him not to move. When Bastian looked at Luc Bichel in the moonlight, he thought about how she had told him not to move. Now he realized that coming from her lips, that command sounded simply excellent. Bastian dreamed that she would quickly take him. When he woke up, the first thing he did was call his wife, but to his regret, he noticed that she had not been released. He looked at the empty bed in surprise and thought that she had just gone to take a bath. Bastian sighed as he thought that, of course, she wanted to wash up after what they did yesterday. Bastian was shocked and wondered if he was the only one who was this embarrassed. Bastian, in turn, missed her very much and wondered when she would return to him. The butler looked at the young gentleman and said that the Marquise had returned to Luard. Bastian looked at the butler in shock and asked where she had returned. To Gould said that she had gone to her estate. The young man asked in bewilderment why she had left. The butler did not understand this question, but for him, everything was clear. Gould said that Luc Bichel was the Marquise of Luard, and it was quite natural that she would return to her domain. The young man was stunned by what he heard. He could not believe that she did this to him. He shouted in anger and looked at the butler. He asked how she could leave him. The butler looked at him puzzled and asked how he knew. The maids trembled with fear and told the master that he would ruin the outfit. Bastian looked at him and asked what he meant. He doesn't know. The butler said that my lady didn't give any special orders on this matter. Bastian asked the butler angrily if he really meant to say that his wife had spent the night with him and left him. Before Bastian woke up, Luke kept a close eye on her husband. She looked at him with embarrassment as she saw that he was sleeping very soundly. Luke saw that he had a beautiful body, moderately muscular, and his collarbones were so protruding that you could fit a glass of water in them. But the best thing of all, of course, was his face. She couldn't forget the previous night. She remembered how he kissed her tenderly and gently whispered her name. After the events of last night, she is sure that this is love, a perfectly rehearsed game. But still, she wondered who cared about this pretense. She saw that he had prepared well and played well, and she was his actress. She knew that no matter what he was trying to do, she didn't mind at all. Luke knew that maybe it was just a game, but she couldn't remember the last time she had this much fun. She understood that since her family had grown, she had to try harder. The young lady looked at Miranda and told her to get everything ready because they were coming back. Miranda looked at the lady in surprise and asked why they didn't spend more time here. She asked the lady if she was really so ready to go. Luke said that she couldn't be away for too long. Luke wondered if it was so dangerous for her husband to be in the capital, should she take him to her estate? She knew she needed to understand what situation he was in now. She knew that there was only one person in the kingdom who could tell her about her husband. Bastian screamed furiously that this was even worse than eating and running away. The butler looked at his master and said that he deserved it. And an arrow pierced the young man after the butler's words. All the servants were whispering that their master had been abandoned by his wife, as they were too embarrassed to even talk about it. The child said that the young lady was a busy person, and her life was not like his. The butler looked at the gentleman and said that he was a lazy person who was always getting into trouble. Gould told the gentleman to calm down. First, he said that his parents had always been lenient with him. This did not mean that the Marchioness would do the same. Bastian asked when his parents had ever been lenient with him. He said that his father never forgave him for his mistakes, nor did his mother. The butler looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked if he was really so dissatisfied that he was even taking off his clothes. Bastian angrily asked the butler if he really called this clothes. He took off his jacket and threw it on the ground in anger. Bastian was very angry and said that this was not right, not even close. Looking in their mirror, he realized that he couldn't keep his wife. He wondered if she had figured him out. He thought he had her. He realized he hadn't, but he knew that after all the effort he had put in, he wasn't going to back down. The queen looked at the young lady in surprise, but a moment later, she closed the door in front of her. She shouted that she would not approve of the divorce. Luke asked her in confusion what she was talking about. She didn't understand what was going on at all. The queen said the ink on their wedding certificate was barely dry. The queen said that such a document was always written on blotting paper so that it could not be spoiled, and the ink was already dry. The queen asked the young lady warily if she really wanted to divorce him. Luke sighed heavily and said that she had not come for that reason. She asked the queen, puzzled, to open the door. The queen smiled and said that no matter how much she thought about it, she could not understand what brought her here. The queen asked why the newlywed wife came to her immediately after the wedding night. The queen shuddered as she knew the answer to that question. She knew that Bastian had fainted twice in front of the young laziness. How the two described the meeting was slightly different. The queen was perplexed and still did not believe that he married Luke just a few days after they met. She knew that Bastian was just a crook. Luke looked at the queen and said that she needed to know something from her. She looked at the young lady. She wondered if the wedding night had been that bad. Queen, she knew he was a worthless man. She wondered what good was his cute face and magnificent body then. She knew he was just a pathetic piece of trash, since he couldn't satisfy his wife. Now the queen understood what they meant when they said a man was empty. The young lady called the queen. Luke asked the queen why she looked so surprised, as if she thought her husband was the last piece of trash. Luke smiled and said that now she was married and the head of the family. She said that it was not like anyone would leave their own husband, so the queen could be honest with hers. Luke looked at the queen and asked what she ordered Bastian to do. The queen looked at the young lady in shock, but a moment later, she looked away and said that she had never given him any orders. Luke looked at the queen and told her to look her in the eyes. The queen sighed heavily and said that she had had enough of joking. She was quite serious when she said that she had told her the truth, when she said that she had not commissioned him to do anything. Either she looked at her and asked if her husband was the type to obey orders without question. The young lady now realized the truth. She looked at the queen and said that it was a sensible remark on her part, but still she had no reason to doubt it. Luke, does this mean that she has nothing to do with the dangerous game Bastian is playing? The queen looked at her in surprise and asked how much she knew. Luke said that she knew that Bastian Effenberg was more cunning than she thought. The queen looked at the young lady intently and said that she was mistaken. Luke looked at her in bewilderment. The queen said in all seriousness that he was much more cunning than she could imagine. The queen asked with a smile if she was not going to abandon her dear nephew. The young lady looked at the queen and said that she knew she wouldn't do that. Luke asked the queen how she could think that about her. The young lady looked at the queen and said that if her highness could not protect Bastian, then she would. Luke said with a soft smile that after all he was now her family. The queen smiled and asked the young lady for forgiveness. Luke said that next time she would make an official visit, she would take her husband with her. The queen thanked her with a smile and asked her not to lose faith in her nephew. The young lady smiled and said that she had told the queen before that this was not her style. The queen looked at the young lady with tears in her eyes, as she had grown up very quickly. As she left the castle, she felt someone's gaze on her, and in the blink of an eye, everything turned around. The young lady looked out the window. She felt someone's familiar presence. She looked at the shadow with a sharp, angry gaze and saw that it was Eugene Sorel. Bastian looked out the window and told the butler to look out the window at the peacocks, who looked in love. He said that they reciprocated each other's feelings. The butler was shocked that his master was making a drama in front of him. He thought that his master had completely lost his mind. But still, it seemed very strange to him. The butler understood that he had been too harsh with his master. Since no matter how vile he was, the butler still sympathized with him, Dvoretsky looked closely at the young master and told him to pull himself together, since it was sad to look at him. Bastian in turn was sad. Bastian asked the butler what the male looked like, and the butler, perplexed, said that he had bright plumage. The young man said that everything was correct, since the male peacock cleans his feathers to attract the female with his elaborate beauty, and sometimes they even sing and dance. The butler sighed heavily, wondering what kind of nonsense he kept talking about. But strangely enough, he was beginning to get used to his whining. He sighed heavily and said that even peacocks put in so much effort. Bastian said that now that he thought about it, he still had a lot of effort to put in. The butler looked at the young gentleman in bewilderment and asked if he had really tried. The young man said that the peacock uses every opportunity to attract a female. He said with fury that he was still far from him. She looked at the young gentleman in surprise and told him to wait a little since he needed to think rationally. The butler asked the young master what he planned to do next. Bastian looked at the butler in surprise and asked, "What do you mean?" Bastian said with a satisfied smile that of course he would sing and dance. He told the butler that he was leaving for Lord right now, so they all needed to get ready. Arthur looked at the lady and asked what she planned to do with the prisoners. Luke knew that Marquise Veron had sent away his second son after Bastian got his money. She knew that it was the mercenary who remained the problem. The young lady looked at Arthur and asked if they had said anything. Arthur sighed heavily and said that they had not said anything. She looked at him and told him to take care of them, to get information. Luke said she thought she wouldn't do that anymore. Miranda looked at the young lady and said that she should still stop now, while she still could. Miranda looked away from the young lady and said that she was sure that he was hiding something. She was sure that her husband would be more dangerous than she thought. Miranda told the lady to beware of him. The young lady looked at her in bewilderment and asked if she really thought so. Luke looked at Miranda and said that while he might be dangerous, she didn't think he was dangerous to her. Miranda said that was not what she meant and asked the lady for forgiveness. The young lady looked at her and said that it was all right, as she understood what Miranda meant. The young lady smiled and said that the capital was a very dangerous place to enjoy a passionate honeymoon with a handsome husband. She said that she, a timid girl, had better return to her estate. Arthur looked at the young lady and said that she should not worry about such things. He said with a satisfied smile that he would do everything he could to make her honeymoon unforgettable. She said with a smile that he was so convincing that she relied on him. She asked if he would leave early. Luke said that she was a little tired, so she would go in the carriage. He looked at her and said that he would do everything. The young lady looking after him wished him a good journey. Luke was worried about him and hoped that everything would be fine. Miranda looked at the young lady warily. She was very worried about her. Miranda was a little wary, as she did not know what her mistress wanted to tell her, that she even sent Arthur away. Miranda saw that her mistress looked happy and relaxed, but it was just an act. She knew that there was definitely something hidden behind her radiant smile, but she couldn't figure out what it was. Luke was barely 10 years old when she appeared before the queen, in all her glory, recognized as a hero after exterminating the demons, exiled to the desert, and changing the borders of the kingdom. Miranda thought that after going through so much, she would finally rest. But out of nowhere, Bastian appeared and began to stir up trouble and turned everything upside down. But what irritated her most was that for some reason unknown to her, the lady liked him. A moment later, Miranda heard a voice. She froze in place. She was ordered not to move and listen quietly. Miranda was shocked as she realized that this was the Marquise's telepathy. The Marquise hoped that Arthur would not get into trouble. The Marquise asked how many spies were left in the capital. Miranda said that there were only 4 of them left. She already guessed what the lady would order her to do with them. The young lady looked into the distance with a smile, but she ordered Miranda to find out if they were still alive. The Marchioness looked at Miranda and said with a smile that they should also return. The Marchioness told Miranda that if they were still alive, then they should be dealt with immediately. Miranda looked at the Marchioness in surprise and said that they should leave immediately since the carriage had already arrived. Luke deliberately placed spies in the capital, but not a single one has reported what happened. She knew that meant either they were all dead or they had overcome her. The Marquise told Miranda through telepathic communication that she had one request for her. The Marquise told Miranda to find out who Eugene Sorel had been dating lately. Arthur, in turn, raced on horseback, and all the way he thought about his mistress. He remembered how the Queen first introduced them. The Queen introduced Arthur and said that he was an intelligent and educated knight with a wonderful reputation. The Queen told her that she would stay with him and learn from him. The young lady looked at him shyly and greeted him. Luke felt uneasy. Arthur looked at her puzzled. He was a little surprised since she was just a baby. But a moment later, he knelt before her and said he looked forward to working with her. He knew that a lot had happened in 10 years, and that the Marquis had spent part of his time fighting on the battlefield. and the rest of the time she devoted to her studies. She became strong in spirit and body. He was proud of her achievements. He knew that their lady was a wonderful person and an impressive personality. Thinking back to the time just before she arrived at the palace, the young lady looked depressed. He was at a loss and wondered why this had happened. The young lady looked at the butler in surprise and asked if her husband had really gone to Luard. The butler apologized to the marquise and said that her husband was very surprised when he learned that she had returned to her estate, so he left through the portal. The young lady was a little surprised. She said that her husband did not possess magic. She asked how he was able to open the portal. Miranda looked at the lady and said with a smile that Ellie was not there. The young lady looked at Miranda and said that they were still going to go to her estate. She said that it was safer there until they returned. The butler looked at the young lady with puzzlement and said that she had better leave right away. The young lady looked at him in confusion and asked why she should leave right now. She asked if something had happened. The butler sighed heavily and said that it was his fault and he should have taught the young master better. The butler said that he was now most likely drunk dancing in front of the palace. He said that he was very ashamed to tell her about it. The butler said that his young master took the strongest wine they had and left. The young lady was surprised, looked at him, and asked if he could explain everything in more detail. He started talking about peacocks. Well, it was not the success of another to cook the story. To the end, he said that she should still hurry. He said that he was ashamed to say this, but the young master was crazy and completely out of his mind. The young lady told the butler not to worry, as there was an excellent medicine for such madmen. The butler looked at the young lady with tears in his eyes. He said that she could not even imagine how grateful he was to her. A moment later, he fell to his knees and begged her to take care of their master. Miranda looked at Arthur and asked if he thought the genre of the story had changed. Arthur, in turn, frowned and thought. Ellie was shocked as she was sitting charmingly on the madman's shoulder. He didn't even let her finish her meal, and she was in the grapes. He sighed heavily and said that they were already there. He was surprised as it was indicated that traveling through the portal is much faster. He came closer to the gate and told them to open it and meet the new husband of the marquise. Ellie was shocked because she knew that he was just a madman and had completely lost his mind. She was in shock and didn't know what to do with this psycho. She was very ashamed of him. Bastian looked at her and told her to do something, or he would make a roast out of her. She looked at him with fury and asked if he was really gone. She said that he could try, if he could, after the night with the lady. He had the ability to understand her in the form of a lizard. She looked at him and said that it was very impudent of him to command her. After her mistress had abandoned him, he asked heavily how she knew this. She said that he himself told her. She asked if he had forgotten about it. Ellie said that she understood that he lived a carefree life. But if he was here like that, then sooner or later, he would be buried alive somewhere in the vicinity of the estate. He looked at her and sighed heavily, saying that this had happened to him several times before she was shocked, and asked if he was serious Ellie, who dared to do this to the Duke's son. He looked at her and, breathing heavily, said that of course it was obvious that it was the Duke or the Queen, said that if she was going to continue insulting him, then she should get off his shoulder. A moment later, he threw her into the distance. She turned into a human and asked how he could throw away such a cute lizard. Ellie knew that he was just a heartless person. She came closer to him and asked what would happen if he really killed the lizard. Now looked at her and said that judging by her impudent speech, it was she. Ellie said furiously that their poor lady and she couldn't believe that he had tricked her into agreeing to this fake marriage. Bastian looked at her indignantly and said that if anyone had been fooled, it was him. He looked at the maid and said that her lady slept with him and then dumped him. Bastian asked if she didn't understand the whole situation. She said that it was just sucking on the body which would disappear after death. She asked what was wrong with that she used his body and left. Bastian was shocked. He said that he thought she should stop eating and breathing, then because one day she would die too. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he would really do that. Ellie, in turn, noticed that he took something before they went through the portal. She was confused, as she didn't see what it was. A moment later, she saw that he was holding a surveillance log about Luke Bischel. She was furious because he was both cruel, obsessive, and downright annoying. And it was obvious to her that he had some ulterior motive. He looked away from her and told her not to try to establish him, as he could do whatever he wanted. She asked in surprise if he was really going to sing that song. A moment later, he began to sing about how Luke had married you in secret from everyone. And then she had a wonderful night with Bastian Effenberg, and the next morning he was dumped by her. Ellie was in shock from his actions. She screamed furiously and asked if he had gone mad. She screamed that everything he had just sung was a complete lie. He furiously asked how it was a lie, since it was the truth. Ellie looked at him and asked what he meant by a secret wedding. She said that it was he who came first to her mistress with a proposal of marriage. He sighed heavily and said that the world needed to know the truth. He was hurt that he was abandoned after being used. He said that they had married and signed the relevant documents, which meant that he was officially her husband, and at the same time, the Marquis of Luard. He said it would be very problematic for him if people didn't know about it. Ellie knew it would be a sight to behold if he kept his mouth shut now. A moment later, they froze as someone called Ellie. The knight looked at the maid and said that they should report the suspicious man, and also asked where Miranda and Arthur were. Bastian was shocked by such ridiculous insults. He looked at the knights and said that he was the husband of their marquise. He said that they should show him the appropriate respect. Ellie was shocked because he behaved just terribly. She said that he was just shameless. He shouted again for them to show their respect to him. Since he is a marquis, you said that her ladyship is not even in the palace yet, and if she were here, they would raise the flag on the tower. But as they see it is not there. They were confused. Bastian was in shock. He realized that he was doomed. Ellie looked at him and asked how many times she had to repeat herself. She said that their lady was not what he thought. He thought for a moment, as his sanity returned. He said that he would stop singing right now. Ellie was a little surprised as he quickly sobered up. He sighed heavily and said that if she was telling the truth, then his friend had not abandoned him. He said that she must be on her way to the estate. He looked at the castle and said that in that case he should prepare the estate for her return. He asked us what their mistress was spending the money she earned, since he saw that the palace was primitive. Bastian sighed heavily and said that he thought it was time to change everything, sir. He knew that this was a new stage in her life. He knew that he no longer needed to look at stupid pages and think about her. He learned that he no longer had to beg the queen for information about his wife at secret meetings. He understood that she was no longer just an image that he could only tell about in a book. Luke looked at the knight and asked where Mr. Bastian was. The knight looked at the marquise in surprise. A moment later, the knight said, greeting the marquise politely, that the gentleman was in the guest room. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she hoped he hadn't done anything wrong. She hoped he hadn't sung or danced in front of her subordinates. The knight looked at her in bewilderment. She looked at the knight and said that if he hadn't done anything, then he didn't have to worry about it, and also thanked him. She thought that he wasn't a complete psycho anymore, and at the same time, she felt relieved. He looked at her and with a beaming smile said that she had arrived earlier than he expected. He welcomed her home. She was shocked because it was actually her house. She smiled and asked if he was waiting for her. She looked away in bewilderment and saw that he had gathered all the servants. She was perplexed. Bastian looked at his wife and said that these lords were reporting to him about important matters that he should know. The young lady was a little surprised. She said that they could do it later, although she understood that he was right. Since he was here, he should do such things first. She looked at everyone present and said with a smile that it was very good that they were all here since she was going to introduce him anyway. She looked at them with a smile and asked their permission to formally introduce her first husband to them. The young man froze in bewilderment when he heard that he was her first husband. He looked at her and asked with a smile which first husband she was talking about. He said that it was not a very funny joke on her part. The young lady looked at him in surprise and said that it was not a joke. She looked at him and asked if he knew that her mother was from the Creeby clan. She said that, according to the tradition of their clan, they could have 5 husbands. The servants looked at the newlyweds warily. The young lady looked at her husband and said that in fact her father was her 3rd husband. Bastian looked at her in shock and, asking for forgiveness, asked what she was talking about. Luke smiled at him and told him that he didn't need to worry, as she doubted that she would be able to find anyone even close to him. She smiled a satisfied smile and said that if he did well, he could remain his only husband. The young man was shocked by her words. The young lady looked at him intently. She liked his reaction. She couldn't take her eyes off him, as even his surprised face was beautiful. Bastian was stunned by what he heard. Ellie looked at the young master and said that of course she knew he was as beautiful as a flower, but she didn't think he was as delicate. The young man asked in a hoarse voice where his wife was. Now Ellie looked at him and said that the lady, of course, had gone to work. Ellie said that, "Of course you are different from those who do not earn a living. Their mistress is always at work." The young man was irritated by her words. He looked at her and asked, "Who said that he does not earn a living?" She looked at him and said that speaking of his work, she had heard that he had been involved in a rather dangerous matter. He said that with great profit comes great risk. She looked at him in surprise and asked if rich people were always so insatiable. He asked, puzzled, why his wife was so busy. He did not understand what she could be doing on these lands. Ellie sighed heavily and said that he shouldn't talk like that at all. She said that not so much time had passed since Lord became the Marquise's property, and naturally there was a lot of unfinished business. She said that besides, their lady spent most of her time away from Luard, and he was one of the reasons why she was busy instead of her rightful rest. Ellie hoped that he now understood the whole situation. He sighed heavily and said that he hoped that soon she would be able to rest at least a little. Ellie said that she would like that too, but unfortunately, their beautiful lady would soon be going to war again. Bastian shuddered at her words. He jumped up and asked the maid what she was talking about. He said that she had just recently returned from an expedition. Ellie said that the lady had no choice, since the Marquise was the best at fighting demons in their kingdom. He looked at her in shock and asked if she had just spoken about demons. Bastian asked if their numbers had increased again. Ellie thought for a moment and said that there was some strange demon activity in the desert. A moment later, she was taken aback as she realized she had made a mistake. She looked away from him and told him to forget about what she had just said. Ellie said that in any case, he shouldn't worry about what the Marchioness said recently. She said that it was true that polygamy was allowed in the Credi clan. Their lady would never do that. He noticed that she had changed the subject. He realized that his wife would indeed soon go hunting demons. He was furious because he realized that he had become useless again. Bastian looked at her and asked how she knew that her mistress would not remarry. Ellie said that her mistress did not care about her clan, so there was absolutely no reason for her to follow all the traditions right. He looked at her and said that even if her mistress did not observe the customs now in their kingdom, the traditions of the clans were recognized as long as the queen's permission was valid. He asked how he was to be sure that in the future, Luke would want permission. He said that the queen was very favorable to his wife. She could definitely get permission. He said that he was not saying this because he was close to Her Majesty. It was just that the queen could really be weak towards those who had won her favor. Bastian knew that Eugene Sorel was a living example of this. Ellie sighed heavily, looking at the young gentleman, and said that their lady was not like that. She said that as much as she didn't want to, she would be responsible for his safety for some time. Ellie looked at him with a smile and told him not to worry. As long as he was Luke Bishel's husband, she would protect him even if he was a complete idiot. She smiled and said that provided he did not betray her mistress, she would protect him with her own life. Ellie, looking at Bastian, said that it was her mistress who asked her about this. He was surprised and stunned, as he did not expect to hear something like this. Ellie remembered her first meeting with the young lady. Ellie was crying. She was lonely and scared. Ellie looked with tears in her eyes at the beautiful lady who was holding out her hand to her. Ellie accepted the lady's help with joy and recognition. She was very grateful to her. Bastian looked at the maid in surprise and asked why she was doing all this. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked what kind of strange question he asked her. She looked at him intently and asked if they didn't look alike. Ellie came closer to him and said that she would like to ask him a counter question. She asked why he married her mistress. Bastian looked at her and said that it was not something he wanted to discuss with a lizard. Ellie looked at him and said that he could do as he pleased. Bastian said that today she would be his personal maid. Ellie screamed that she did not want to do this. He looked at her and said that she had said that she was sure of her mistress, which meant that she should be faithful to him as well. He said that a husband and wife are emotionally and materially one, and this unity begins from the moment the marriage certificate is signed. Ellie looked at him with disdain and said that he was talking too much for his first husband. Bastian looked at her angrily and said that she could see that her mistress would not have a second husband. The young lady slowly approached her husband. She quietly came closer and watched him closely. Bastian looked at her and said that she must have a lot of work. She looked at him in surprise, as she thought he was sleeping. Luke timidly asked him for forgiveness for coming to him so late. He looked at her and said with a smile that everything was fine since she had not abandoned him. She smiled and said that it was not even that, since she should have warned him earlier. Bastian took her hand gently and said he was wrong. So Bastian asked her not to apologize to him. He looked at her and said that he heard that she would soon go to war. The young lady looked at him puzzled, as she was shocked that he knew this information. She said that it had not been decided yet. Bastian said that he hoped that this decision would not be made. She looked at him in surprise. His words made her heart beat even faster in her chest. He looked at her and said that if she didn't need him, then he needed her. Luke looked at him in surprise and asked why he suddenly started talking about this. He said that she might not have noticed it, but he always wanted to get closer to her. Bastian looked at her seriously and said that somewhere along the way he had fallen in love with her. The young lady looked intently at her husband and timidly said that this was not love. He smiled and said it was no problem. He knew it didn't mean anything anymore, and he didn't want to waste any more time arguing with his wife. He smiled a beaming smile, and Luke just wanted to be around him. Bastian hugged her tightly and said that this already made him happy. He wanted to spend more time with him. Luke looked at her husband in surprise and asked if he shouldn't be in his chambers now. Bastian said he was fine. She looked at him and said she didn't have much planned today. Luke said she thought it would be better for him to go back to his room and lie down for a little while longer. She said she would come back to him as soon as she finished her work. He sighed heavily and said that everything was fine, and he would like to do some work too. Miranda looked closely at the young gentleman and said that she had managed to find them. She looked at them and said that she had been looking for them for a long time. The Marquis's mustache looked at her in surprise and asked what had happened. Miranda said that she had received news that the doctor he had requested from the duchy had just arrived. Bastian said that this was good news and asked to be escorted to his room. Miranda said there was someone who would like to meet him. She looked at them and said that the Duke had also arrived to them. The young people looked at her in surprise. The Duke sighed heavily as he looked at his son. He was a little surprised by his condition. The Duke looked at him intently and asked why he looked like that. He said that it had only been a couple of days since his marriage. The young man sighed heavily and said that this was a completely natural reaction. The Duke looked at his son in surprise and asked angrily what reaction he was talking about. Bastian said that it was a process of accepting Credi's magic. He said that it was not a disease, so his father did not need to worry about such things. He said that being connected to his wife, he would have to go through it. The Duke was stunned by what he heard. He asked his son if he was really talking about magic. The Duke, with tears in his eyes, said that he thought this meant that he was not a completely useless idiot. He said that he was proud of his son. The young man looked at his father in bewilderment and asked what he was even talking about. Bastian sighed heavily and said that none of this mattered. He asked his father if he was aware that his wife would soon be leaving on a military expedition. He was asking about it because he probably knew exactly when it would take place. The Duke looked at the young man and asked what he meant. By soon the young man hesitated and said that he thought in 6 months. The Duke sighed heavily and said that now he understood how slowly time was passing for him. The Duke said that the Queen would soon call her officially. The Duke looked at his son and said that by soon he meant next month. Bastian was shocked by what he heard, as he didn't expect that. Bastian sat for a while and stared at his father. He could not understand how Her Majesty could act like this. He said that not even a month had passed since his wife returned to her estate. The Duke looked at his son and said sharply that he was completely powerless in relation to Luc Bichel and the Queen. The young man frowned as he himself understood this perfectly well. He clenched his teeth in rage and, looking at his father, asked what he was talking about. The Duke said that she, who had brought Luc Bichel here from the desert and bestowed upon her the title of Marchioness, was Her Majesty, and he in turn was no more than her husband. The Duke told his son that for this reason he must not forget his place. The Duke said that he must not do anything that might upset his wife, in any way. The young man looked intently at his father, but said nothing. A moment later, he said he thought he had already done it. The Duke looked at his son with his fury and said that was why he had come running here. The Duke looked at his son with a heavy sigh and told him that since he was already married, he should try to settle down. He said that even a beautiful flower, which is useful only because you can admire it at some point, will begin to emit an unpleasant smell. The Duke said that he could wither, and it was only a matter of time before he was thrown out. He said that he could not tell what his wife was thinking and what plans she was making for now. She could tolerate his behavior. The Duke asked his son what if she achieved the desired results. Bastian, without looking up at his father, said that then he would have to look for a second option. The Duke was shocked by what he heard. The Duke asked in a trembling voice if he really intended to look for a second wife. The Duke looked at his son with fury and asked if this was really how he intended to live. The Duke said that his filthy mouth was one thing, but to be just as filthy in his behavior was another. He shouted that he would not allow him to do that. The young man looked at his father in bewilderment and asked what had happened. The Duke said that he would still give him a choice. He said that they were both excellent cutters, so he could give him two options for punishment. Bastian looked at his father and told him to calm down and wait. The Duke said with tears in his eyes that he understood that he had raised him so that he had to grow up with such a devilish tongue, but he was sure that he would have albeit modest but healthy preferences in bed. Bastian jumped up from the sofa and said that he was not talking about himself, but about his wife. The Duke looked at his son in bewilderment. Bastian said that in her Creedy clan, they are allowed to have up to 5 husbands. He said that fortunately, he is his wife's first husband and is confident that there will be no others. Looking at his father, he gave him a beaming smile and told him not to worry. He said that his son would not disappoint anyone, both in face and in bed. The Duke gave his son a piercing look, while Bastian beamed with happiness. The Duke looked at his son in bewilderment and asked where he got this unshakable self-confidence from. He said that he knew it was too late to regret it, but he really shouldn't have given Bastian to be raised by his mother. The young man sighed heavily and said that it was mean of him to blame someone who was no longer in this world. The Duke looked at his son and said that, of course, he took after his mother and father. The Duke said that he and his grandmother were people of the same mindset as expected from his lineage. His grandmother became famous for her personality. The Duke of Effenberg was the younger brother of the previous king, and their mother was of course the previous Queen Dowager. The reason why the Dowager ex-queen left the palace and moved to the Effenberg's northeastern residence is none other than her terrible temper. The late king needed to do something for his wife, who left the palace because of her terrible temper. Therefore, he gave her the largest and most prosperous lands into her possession, as well as the title of Duchess, because the king truly loved the queen with all his heart despite her character. The Duke said that his grandfather had asked her and begged her to return, but she had remained in the residence until the very end, living until her death, as she herself considered necessary. The Duke said that he had only now realized that it had been a great mistake to leave him with her. Bastian said that she was just ahead of the time she lived in. He said that the world wasn't ready for her. Bastian was angry because of the fact that his father compared him to his grandmother. The Duke looked at his son and said that this was a very good argument. He asked if this was the reason why he did not come to her funeral, and continued to do what he pleased. The young man said that he was the only one who could understand her. He looked at his father and asked what he understood. Bastian said that he just didn't want to attend a funeral where there were a lot of people, and none of them understood her even a little. The young man said with fury that his father was the king's second son. After all, if his grandmother had not been given the title of Duchess, he would have simply been sold to another state, married according to the laws of the empire. Bastian said that they could have done to him what they did to Eugene Sorel. The Duke was shocked by his son's words. The Duke looked at his son and asked if he hadn't told him to always watch his words. The young man sighed heavily and said that he watches what he says. Bastian sighed heavily and said that they could end their conversation here. He said that he was a doctor. He had to deliver him a magic neutralizer, so he thought he would be back to normal soon. He sighed heavily and said that he understood that he must not become a stain on his wife's impeccable reputation. He said that when she returned victorious from the battle, he would be a gorgeous flower crown adorning her. He said that his wife would take care of him by drying his petals, so he would always be dear to her. He said that this was enough for him. The young lady looked at her husband and asked if he would be all right, since he was already on his feet. She asked if it wouldn't be better if he rested a little. Bastian sprayed himself with water. The young lady looked at her husband in bewilderment. Bastian looked at her and said with a smile that for a handsome man like him, the illness caused by the disease was nothing more than a good moisturizer. He smiled and said that he was really fine, and she shouldn't worry about it. She understood what he meant. She smiled and said that he shouldn't force himself. After all, she looked away from him shyly and said that she would work harder so that they both had enough money. She looked at him and said with a smile that, as they say, a good head of the family should work hard to make his family happy. He looked at her in surprise and asked what difference it made who earned the money. He said that if she earns a lot, it means she can spend more. Bastian asked who gave her such a twisted and stereotypical concept of family. Luke said it was all from her mother. Bastian looked at her stunned. Bastian froze in place. He knew that her mother was from the Credi clan. He knew they were the kind of people who thought a woman should have 5 husbands. Luke looked at her husband in bewilderment and asked what happened. The young man did not look at his wife and said that everything was fine. He just couldn't get over the dizziness. He looked at her with a smile as he knew he had to change the subject quickly. He said that from now on, his money was hers too. He smiled and said that he was the type to spend money wisely, so she would never regret his decisions. She nodded and agreed with him. The young lady said that he would certainly try his best. She said that, for this reason, he could stop his dangerous work now. The young man gave her a beaming smile and said that he did not understand what she was talking about. She smiled and asked if he really thought he could get out of answering with his handsome face. He smiled and said that she was indeed weak against his face. He knew he was in his wife's territory now, and the man he was dealing with was Luc Bichel. He knew he had to put an end to this because he couldn't allow his wife to have so many men. The young man looked at his wife and asked me if it was time for them to go since it was already lunchtime. He came closer to her and offered her his hand with a smile, expecting her to accept his offer. He smiled his radiant and beautiful smile and said that it was time for them to go. She looked at him in surprise as she remembered her past. She froze and could not answer anything. She remembered her friend, who asked her in bewilderment why she froze. He asked if she was really not walking. She was shaking from these memories. Bastian looked at her and asked if everything was okay. She stared at her husband for a moment, without answering him. The young lady was shocked. She wondered if she had gone completely crazy. She did not understand why she remembered this incident now. She smiled and said that she was just distracted and asked for forgiveness. She took his hand and asked with a smile if they should go together. Bastian looked at his wife with confusion and surprise, as he did not expect her to say something like that. He timidly asked if she could say that word again. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked what word he was talking about. He said that he was very pleased to hear a word that began with the letter Vide. Luke looked at her husband and said that Miranda was handling the administration and finances, while the Viscount was dealing with security. Luke said that her estate was located on a small area of former desert, which made her land barren, and due to the lack of food resources, there were few inhabitants. Bastian looked at her and said that meant that the tax income was low. He asked where she was going to get the budget funding. Luke said that, fortunately, by order of Her Majesty, all new territories were exempt from paying taxes, which meant that she could at least keep this place, but they were always in the red. He looked at her and said that there were rumors that she spends all the money she earns on Earth. He asked if this was true. Luke looked at her husband and asked if such rumors were really going around. He said that she must have spent a decent amount of money. Bastian asked why Luard was still in such a deplorable state. She asked in bewilderment about what condition it was in and what was wrong with her estate. He looked at her intently and asked if she really wanted to know what was wrong. Bastian looked at his wife and told her to listen carefully to what he was going to say. He said that for a start, her dishes were too old. Bastian said the plates looked like they hadn't been changed for centuries. He said that the spoons and forks weren't even silver. Luke looked at him in bewilderment and asked if they really had to be silver. He said her furniture was a cobblestone eyesore. Bastian told her to just look at those curtains as they were simply awful. Bastian said that her servant's uniform was simply disgusting. He said that her servants were her face. He didn't understand how she could do this to them. Ellie was in shock and didn't understand what she was doing there. He told her to just look at the fabric the uniform was made of because it was as hard as sandpaper. Ellie looked at her mistress with tears in her eyes. The young man said that he simply could not stay here for more than a minute. He said that this place was far below his standards. Ellie ran away from them with tears in her eyes. The young lady looked at her husband and asked with a smile what he planned to do. He said that since he couldn't lower his standards, he needed to improve this place to his level. He said that now he doesn't need to do a couple of studies. He said that he wants to see the full scale of this abandoned castle, so he's going for a walk now. She smiled and said that he could take the Viscount with him. She said that he was responsible for the safety of the presidential area. He smiled and agreed with her, and said that he had better take the chance and get Gisnell back into shape. The young lady wished him luck, as she knew it would not be easy. Bastian, in turn, looked at Lord from above. He said that he did not expect that Lord was a historical building. Bastian said that it was in excellent condition. Arthur looked at him in surprise and said that this was Lord's presidential zone. Bastian was shocked by what he heard. Bastian looked at his companion and said that he must be joking. He couldn't understand how anyone could live in such a place. He asked if it wasn't an ancient building. He said that the houses looked like huts. Arthur sighed heavily and said that he could see that Bastian understood history, but he didn't think the Marquise would like his words. Arthur looked at the young man and said that this place was special for her ladyship. Arthur said that this place Luard was the most beautiful land that the Marquise had conquered. He said that the Kurt tribe used to live here, a group of demons so powerful that they threatened the very existence of their kingdom, seemingly so invincible, they disappeared in just one day about 10 years ago. Arthur said that their mistress gave the queen the head of their leader. It was then that she became known as the best demon hunter in the entire kingdom. The young man realized that this meant that she was rebuilding the land that she herself had destroyed. Bastian said he thought she had a pathetic hidden side. Arthur looked at the gentleman in bewilderment and, asking for forgiveness, asked what he had just said. Bastian said it must be because she lives in this miserable place. Bastian said that they needed to get rid of these huts and rebuild everything. Arthur looked at the gentleman in bewilderment and asked why he decided to do it so suddenly. Bastian said that Luc Bichel should live in a place befitting her status. He said it was his job to build such a place. Arthur said that was quite an unusual thought for Luc Bichel's first husband. Bastian looked at him irritably and said that if he dared to call him that again, he would be in trouble. Arthur asked the young gentleman in bewilderment what he planned to do. Now the young man thought for a moment. He said, looking at the city, that all the buildings needed to be torn down, and construction of new houses started tomorrow. He wanted to get rid of these ancient huts and build a truly beautiful place. Arthur was shocked and wondered if he really wanted to rebuild everything. Arthur looked at him and said that they didn't have enough budget. Bastian looked at him and told him to shut up. He told Arthur that now, here they didn't need to worry about it anymore. Bastian in turn dozed quietly on the sofa, throwing all thoughts away. Ellie entered his room and asked with a grin how the Marquise's handsome and unemployed husband was doing. She looked at him and said that he had received an invitation. He jumped out of bed and asked what she had just called him. She asked him with a smile if he had heard that their Marchioness was going on an expedition. Ellie said with a smile that for this reason they were going to have a celebratory party, and she thought he would want to be there. She looked at him and said that she thought he would like to take on the event. Bastian said that, of course, he would like to do it, but he was still confused. He asked why she hadn't warned him about it before. Ellie said that he hadn't been feeling well until yesterday, so for that reason, Miranda had made the guest list herself in advance. Ellie said that they were originally supposed to be preparing for the wedding ceremony in Luard, but they didn't have time for it. Bastian looked at her and asked where the guest list was, as he knew he needed to look at it. Ellie said that she thought Miranda wanted to give it to him personally, but she thought that he was just avoiding her. Bastian said that it was not that important. He said that this was the first event that would be organized by him, as the husband of the Marquise. He said that everything should go perfectly. He knew that, of course, he had to do everything he could. The butler looked at the gentleman and said that he had been watching her for several days, and could say with confidence that Luke was an intelligent woman, and now he understood why such a fastidious man as Arthur was so proud of her. Bastian looked at the butler in confusion and asked why he had come. The butler said that, of course, he had come to look after the young master, and he had to make sure that the young master would not be a burden to the lady by getting caught on her legs. He smiled and said that his Lulu had the most beautiful legs, and he just couldn't help but hold on to them. The butler was at a loss. He was puzzled by what Bastian called his wife. A moment later, the butler was burning, that he really hoped that the young master would not use that dog name for his wife. Bastian looked at him with a smirk. He looked at the butler and asked how he could think that such a magnificent and elegant name could belong to some dog. He said that the butler had no taste at all. Bastian said that if he continued to talk such nonsense, he could leave. Bastian looked at the list and said that it was filled with names of people he mostly didn't know. He asked if he should invite them all. The butler said that his mother was the most influential lady in the kingdom, and so he should also take her position into account. The butler looked at him and said that he understood perfectly well what he was feeling. Now Bastian looked at him in bewilderment and told the butler not to make him laugh. Bastian asked in surprise why his wife should be worried that he was from the Effenberg family. He said that all they knew was that this greenery could interfere. The butler felt that he could not tell the young master that it was Bastian, and not the entire Effenberg family, who was the real problem. The butler said that this reminded him of something he had heard earlier, that there would be a banquet here that evening, to show the ladies' support for the upcoming expedition. Gould said there are rumors that the Archduke of Iliska is also planning to attend the event. Bastian looked at the butler sullenly and asked angrily why he was telling him this. The butler asked the young gentleman if he would be all right, as he was embarrassed that all three of them would be in the same room. Luke sighed heavily and walked into the room. She apologized for being late. All the servants stood up politely and greeted the marquise, who looked at them with bewilderment. The young lady was confused and looked at them and asked what was going on here. Bastian looked at his wife and said that he ordered them to do this. She looked at him in bewilderment and did not ask why he did it. He asked Luke if it wasn't obvious. Bastian said that everyone here was taking advantage of her generosity and wasn't even able to greet her properly. He said he couldn't allow that to happen. Luke looked at him with confusion and asked if it was really necessary. She said that everyone working here was important to the castle, Bastian called her. He said that she was a marchioness and a knight of the queen, and that her position in life would only grow with time. He looked at her with a sharp gaze and said that for this reason, she should understand her importance and superiority over those below her. Bastian said that it would only be for the best for them. She wanted to object to him, but Bastian looked at her and said that his task now was to restore order in this castle. He looked at her and said seriously that this was what she had to do. The young lady looked at him intently, but did not respond. A moment later, she finally agreed with him. She looked at everyone present and asked them to obey Lord Bastian from now on. She said that they could all sit down now. The young lady was surprised when she sat down at the table and saw a lot of new dishes. Luke didn't even suspect that he thought so highly of her, but she still wondered why he treated her so well. Luke, in turn, was very touched by his care. She was pleased. Miranda burst into the room screaming and called for the mistress. Luke looked at her in bewilderment and asked what happened. Miranda told the lady that she needed to go quickly and greet the guests, as the Archduke of Iliska Eugene Sorel had arrived. The young lady was confused, as she knew that he had seen them at the wedding. She did not understand why he had come to her. Bastian, in turn, was very irritated. He did not understand why he had deliberately come during their dinner. Ellie screamed furiously and asked if this idiot had nothing better to do. Why did he come to them, since he was already at the wedding? Luke looked at the maid and said that she watched her words. Luke said that she was being disrespectful to the Archduke, but even so, the young lady actually found her words refreshing. Ellie gritted her teeth and said that she was putting it mildly. She said it didn't seem like the big fat royal baby hadn't chosen his words when he visited Lordy. Bastian was surprised that the young man often visited Luard. He knew that the Marquise's estate was far from the capital. Bastian did not understand why he came to them at all. Ellie said that officially he called it a routine periodic regional inspection, but she thought it was all a lie. Luke looked at the maid and told her to stop. Luke said that the Archduke never thought highly of her, And besides, he always suspected her. Bastian asked her in confusion what he suspected her of. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was a mystery to her too. She said that she couldn't say for sure, but she believed that he thought that her existence was a threat. She said that the Archduke was tired of her because she belonged to a different race and also had magical powers, and he considered her more like a demon than a human. Bastian said that it was simply ridiculous, and the Archduke in turn was more paranoid than anyone in the kingdom. The young man looked at his wife and with a smile told her not to pay attention to him since she shouldn't waste her precious time on him. Bastian looked at Miranda and asked where the Archduke was. Now she said that she had taken him to the guest room. Bastian looked at his wife and said with a smile that it was time for them to go meet the guest. Bastian said furiously that he would now show why everyone said that he had the sharpest tongue in the entire kingdom. Bastian in turn was very angry. He did not understand how anyone dared to insult his wife. The young men knocked, and the Archduke said they could enter. The Archduke in turn looked at everyone present with surprise. The young lady bowed and greeted the Archduke, asking forgiveness for keeping him waiting. He looked at her and said that he heard she was having a meal. He asked for forgiveness and said that he had no intention of interrupting. Offended Bastian stood and glared at him. He knew that this was not an accident. The Archduke looked at Lord Bastian and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Bastian looked at the Archduke and said that he was mistaken, since he was now the Marquis of Luperda, and he should have addressed him accordingly. The Archduke asked if he was trying to hide his shortcomings behind his wife's title. The Archduke said that nothing less was expected of him. Everyone present was shocked as they realized that the Archduke was a very caustic young man. Bastian gave him a beaming grin and told him to take a look at himself first. Ellie barely held back a laugh. Bastian told him that he was a man who sold his body to save the kingdom when it was on the brink of destruction. Considering that the Archduke barely managed to survive, he did not believe that the Archduke was capable of throwing such insults. Everyone present was in shock, as the tension was suffocating them. The Archduke in turn looked at Bastian with a sharp and angry expression, but said nothing. A moment later, he told the Marquise to watch his tongue. The Archduke said that as he saw it, being betrothed to the greatest hero of the kingdom had not at all tamed his sharp tongue. The Archduke said that he was a descendant of a weak kingdom, but now he was officially recognized as the husband of the queen of this country, and now he was his relative. The Archduke said to the Marquis that he had shown respect to his queen. Bastian said with a grin that respect should be shown on both sides. The Archduke looked at the Marquise and said that she should teach her people manners. She looked at him and said she was glad he reminded her of that. Bastian was in shock and didn't understand what they were talking about. He wondered if he had gone too far. Luke walked closer to him and asked if he and Lord Bastian weren't in a similar situation. She said that, of course, he should understand how her husband feels being in an unfamiliar place. Far from home, she said that she was sure he could help him as someone knowledgeable in this area. She smiled and said that this was a great opportunity to become friends with each other. The young people were shocked and at the same time puzzled, as it was all a bit far-fetched. She came closer to him and said that it would still be very good if they could all make peace. Luke bowed and said that she hoped they were in good hands with him. Luke said that after all, she was a loyal subject of Her Majesty. The Archduke looked intently at the Marquise, but said nothing in response. She whispered quietly, looking at him, that she would like to tell him something. In the blink of an eye, her face changed, and she told him that he would not dare to touch her husband with a finger, and this was her first and last warning. She knew that Bastian always attracted unnecessary attention to himself, for better or worse, so keeping him out of danger was her immediate task, and to do this, she needed to cooperate with Eugene Sorel to her regret. There was a time when they fought shoulder to shoulder, but unfortunately that was already in the past. Luke Bischel knew the past could never be brought back. The Queen stood between them now, and they could maintain their strained relationship. The young man was the Queen's husband, while she was nothing more than a foreigner, an alien species with mixed blood. Their victories on the battlefield meant that one day the war would end, and she would be unnecessary. She knew that the end justified the means, and Luke knew that she had to achieve her goal by any means necessary, even if she had to bow to them. She looked at him and told him not to make a scene. She said he should leave now, and she would forget about what happened here. She also said she would make sure the queen did not find out about it. He looked at her in surprise fury and twitched. Bastian looked at his wife and asked with rage why she was bowing down to him. He was shocked by such behavior of his wife. The young lady turned and with a smile asked her husband to escort the Archduke to his chambers. He looked at her with a surprised look and asked why he should do this. The young lady came closer to him and tenderly took his hand. He was surprised. She noticed that his hand was very smooth. She knew that these were the hands of the man who had never worked more than one day in his life. She wanted to do everything for him to keep them that way. She knew that his hands should never be stained with blood. She smiled and said that it was all because he was now a marquise. Luke looked at her husband with a tender smile and said that she was asking him to do this for her. He was embarrassed by such tenderness. Of his wife, embarrassed, he still agreed, but said that it was only this time. The young lady looked closely at her husband. She knew that she would make sure that none of her people were harmed. Some time later, they entered the room. The knight asked the marquise, in anger, how he dared. The knight asked if the marquise really thought that the Archduke would remain in this room. The Archduke gestured to the knight to calm down a little and moderate his ardor. The Archduke looked at Arthur and called him. He bowed humbly and said that he was listening to him. He asked if this was really the place that Luard had prepared for his rest. Arthur said that it was definitely not so. The Archduke looked at them in bewilderment and said that this meant that it was the Marquis's personal decision. He said that on his part this was unheard of insolence. The Marquis looked at him with a feigned smile and said that they should have given him better quarters, but many important people had arrived to see them today. The Marquis said that, as he could see, they didn't have many guest rooms, so they politely asked him to accept it just for that night. This offer, you translate from the Marquis, says that there is no need to be picky and you can just rest in this room. The Marquis came closer to him and said that he remembered something. He asked the Archduke if he took care of the rat after they cut off its tail. The Archduke smiled and said that he did everything thanks to them. He said that he was surprised that he was worried about him, and apparently the Marquis had become more mature. The Marquis said with a smile that he always loved animals. The Marquis smiled and said that he would never intentionally endanger an animal he had raised himself. The Archduke told him that he must be under the impression that the Marchioness had taken his side. The Archduke looked at him with contempt and said that nevertheless he should not be mistaken since his wife did not take any side. The Marquis said that he was not at all mistaken, since after all the Queen was not on the Archduke's side either. The Archduke turned around angrily and looked at him with contempt. The Marquis said with a grin on his face that he was afraid that he was now forced to leave him. He said that they could see each other in the evening at the banquet. In the evening at the banquet, all the ladies could not take their eyes off the radiant Marquis. They were a little surprised and stunned, since everyone was talking only about him. The Marquis's husband shone better and brighter than the sun. They admired his beauty too, for he was the one everyone was talking about. The young ladies saw that he was as handsome as the rumors said. But everyone also heard that he had a terrible character. They were wondering how terrible he was. Bastian noticed that Bella Bruno and Constantine Siena were present at the event. He knew that the place was filled with faces he would rather not see. He turned around as if to leave. He knew better than to even breathe in their direction. A moment later, Miranda came closer to him. Bastian was a little surprised. He looked into the distance and heard laughter echoing throughout the hall. He looked at her intently, for from the way she carried herself and her general demeanor, she looked like a high-ranking noble lady, which was rare to find in Luard. The Marquis looked at Miranda and asked who the woman was, who was making such a noise as he had never seen her before. Miranda looked at her intently and said that it was Arthur's wife. The Marquis was shocked. He asked if this was really his daughter. Miranda hesitated and said that there was a whole story behind Lord Arthur's situation. Miranda said that she still shouldn't have told him about it. The Marquis turned around and said that in that case, he would ask himself. Miranda was in shock and shouted after him. A moment later, the Marquis came up to the ladies to greet them. He looked at the young lady and said that he had heard that she was Arthur's wife. The young lady looked at him in surprise, but later, changing her expression, she gave him a beautiful smile. She smiled and said she was honored that he had come up to talk to her. She asked how he was doing and also said that she was Henrietta Blavet. Bastian looked at the young lady in surprise. and said that he would never have thought that Arthur could marry a man who was much younger than himself. The young lady smiled and said that her husband would laugh if he heard what he said, as he was actually younger than her, being 35. Bastian was shocked he didn't understand how this was possible, with such a face. The young lady smiled and said that the truth was that a spell had been cast on him during the war. Bastian looked at her in surprise and said that this was big news to him. Bastian asked what spell she was talking about and how it happened. He smiled and said that he was sure this story was very interesting. He looked at her with a smile and asked her to tell him about everything in more detail. The young lady said she didn't mind sharing it with him, since everyone in town already knew about it. She asked why not save it for when he was bored. She said that, besides, she had a feeling that something great and interesting was going to happen that night. Miranda looked at the young lady and asked if this was one of her predictions. The Marquis looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really a poppy or something like that. The Marquise smiled and said that Henrietta was a famous fortune teller. In the past, she was even called to the battlefield to predict the future. Henrietta smiled and said that all that was in the past, now she only predicted fortunes for fun. Bastian smiled and said that he had had his fortune told before, and he asked if she could tell him what his fortune was today. The young lady looked at him closely and smiled. She said that he would have simply amazing luck today. He smiled and said that it sounded very interesting. He said that he should pay her a generous fee for her work. Henrietta smiled and thanked him. Henrietta looked closely at the Marquise. Now she understood why their mistress had chosen him. Henrietta looked at the Marquis and said with a smile that it seemed that he and Ellie had become very close. He smiled and said that he was thinking of raising her well and making her into a beautiful bag, as she had very smooth skin. Henrietta smiled and said that she was quite sure that it would be very difficult to do. After all, Ellie was the last survivor of the Kurt tribe. The top brass even protected her with legal measures. Bastian looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what legal measures. She said legal measures to protect species that are in danger of extinction. He said that he heard that it was Luke who destroyed the Kurt tribe. Henrietta looked at him and said that it was true, and to be more precise, it was Her Majesty who gave the order to the Marquise to conquer them. Henrietta said that if the Marquise had not obeyed, she would have been killed on the spot the task. But he looked at the young lady and asked if she really wanted to say now that the Queen could kill his wife. He asked with bewilderment why she thought so. The young lady looked at him intently and hesitated timidly. A moment later, she said with a smile that she didn't think it was something she could tell him in a place like this. The Marquise wondered for a moment if she was saying that this place was too public to discuss the matter. The young lady looked at him and asked if he had said that his fortune had been told before. The Marquis said that she should know, since before almost every evening there were fortune tellers, since they were previously very popular, and his family was no exception. He said that his fortune was told in pictures. She looked at him and said with fury that there was a vile bastard in this family. The Duchess looked at the woman and said that everyone in the kingdom knew about this bastard. In their family, she asked if she could predict something else. The Duchess looked at her and told her to watch and see when their son would become a decent man. The woman said she couldn't tell them that, because it was beyond human capabilities. The Duchess looked at her and said she had really hit the nail on the head. The woman asked why they didn't ask something more specific. The Duchess agreed with her. The Duchess asked if her son would ever be able to marry with such a terrible character. The young man looked at his mother intently and told her to stop. The Duchess shouted angrily at her son and told him to shut up, as she was only asking because she was worried about him. The woman with a satisfied grin said that it was a very good question. She saw a young and handsome lord in front of her. She said he could pick a card, and she would look at it. She said they would see right away if he found a partner that was right for him. At that moment, the card showed him his future, and he was happy with it. Bastian looked at his companion and said that as far as he understood fortune-telling on cards, it was very intuitive. He asked what tools she used. Henrietta smiled and said that a real master is not picky about the tools they use. Ellie smiled and said that it was a long time ago, and also asked the Viscountess to show them all her skills. Henrietta looked at her and asked if she should do it. Henrietta thought for a moment what she should use in this situation. A moment later, she saw a handful of candies. She asked how about she use them today. Everyone present was surprised that the Viscountess wanted to use candy for fortune, telling they said that they should go and take a closer look, as it was very charming of her. The Viscountess smiled and said that they could choose the candy they liked and put the rest back in the bowl. A moment later, Bella greeted the Viscountess with a smile. Bella said that they only came because they heard that they were doing something fun. Henrietta greeted the young lady with a smile. Henrietta said that the Lord asked her to make him a prediction. The Viscountess said that a lot of time had passed since she did it, so she decided to try. She invited Bella to join them too. Bella looked at Constantine and told him to also choose a candy. Constantine sighed heavily and said that he was fine as is. Constantine wanted to walk over and sit down, but Bastian tripped him and he fell to his knee. Constantine looked at the young man with fury and asked if this trick wasn't old-fashioned. He smiled and said that, as a swordsman, he should have realized that it was a trap before falling into it. Bastian said with a smirk that it seemed like his skills were pretty rusty. They stared at each other for a while. Henrietta looked at them and asked them to calm down. She smiled and said that today was a good day, so they did not need to fight, and she would tell the fate of the Lord first. The Lord said that he would first let her know the fate of the idiot's red salmon. Bella looked at him with fury and asked what he was trying to do. The young man sighed heavily and said that the main guest always goes last. She looked at him, and the cheese with disdain said that every word from his mouth was disgusting. Bella looked at Henrietta and said with a smile that she had already chosen a candy. Henrietta looked closely at the candy and said with a smile that it was strawberry. Henrietta thought about it and said that the candy wrapper was also red. She said that the strange aura suited her very well. The Viscountess looked at the butler and asked if she could borrow some lighting from him. She said that a lamp or a candle would be fine. The servant said that he would do everything right away. Henrietta looked at everyone present and said with a smile that now they had everything they needed, and said that they could begin. A moment later, she took the candy wrapper and set it on fire. The room burst into flames. Everyone looked at the candle in surprise. They stared at the picture because they did not know whether it was a star or a tree. Bella, in turn, looked criminally at the fire and said that it was her family's coat of arms, the brightest red cross, and thorns in the desert. The Viscountess smiled and told the young lady that it looked like she would be the head of her family in the future. Bastian looked at the young lady intently and said with a grin that it was very unfortunate that she would be the future head of the family. She looked at him furiously and asked what he had just said. The Lord said that it was obvious that her elder sister should be the next Duchess, no matter how she looked at it, and it made no sense for her to be chosen as the next Duchess when her sister was so much better than her. She looked at him with fury and said that he was in no position to worry about the future of her family. She asked what about his house, which only he had. Bastian looked at her intently frowning as he asked why he had to be the only one at his house. He looked at her and said with a smirk that they now had Luc Bichel. Everyone present was shocked by this statement. Constantine looked at him and asked if he really meant to say that he would make the Marquise the next Duchess. Bastian looked at the young man with disdain and asked how he dared to raise his hand against him. He told him to let him go right now. Constantine looked at him and told him to answer his question first, and then he would let him go. Bastian asked in bewilderment why he should do this. He said that he had no desire to answer this question. Constantine was shocked. The Marquise told Constantine that if he valued the reputation he had built with these wrists, he had better let him go now. Otherwise, he would make sure that Constantine would never be able to pick up a sword again. Bastian said that he bet that Constantine thought his words were empty. He asked Constantine if he really believed that he, the son of a duke, could not cope with such a threat. Constantine, gritting his teeth, looked at Bastian and threw his hand away with a scream. Constantine shouted to the Lord that from the moment he first saw him, he immediately did not like him, since all he does is just chat. Constantine left in anger and abandoned their company. He could no longer bear Bastian's presence. The Lord looked at the young lady and said that he took back his words about paying her a generous fee. The Viscountess looked at him in bewilderment. He said he thought she said he was going to be lucky today, but with all the annoying idiots here to pick on him, he said that if today was supposed to be his lucky day, then he thought he had a good idea of what his future looked like. The young lady laughed quietly, for she thought he had brought this upon himself. She looked at him and said with a smile that everything was just beginning, and that there was a long and beautiful night ahead. She said that perhaps her abacus was not the same as it used to be, but her ability was simply to predict fate, and it still worked. She looked at him and asked if he could pass her the candy he had chosen. They sat in silence for a while, looking at each other. The young lady looked at him and asked if he could pass her some candy. Bastian sighed heavily and said that he felt like he had wasted his time on a pointless scheme. He asked if she was sure she could do it. Henrietta smiled and said that she was, of course, confident in her abilities, and also asked if he had chosen the candy. A moment later, he handed them a purple candy, and Henrietta smiled. He smiled and said that he chose this particular candy because it was the same color as his wife's eyes. The Viscountess was completely pleased, and smiling, Bella in turn could not understand whether he was seriously blushing because of this. Henrietta smiled and said it was very good, and asked if she could have a look. A moment later, she held the wrapper to the fire, but it did not catch fire. Bella was surprised and did not understand why this was happening. She did not understand why the wrapper did not burn. Henrietta said that magic is the unification of consciousnesses. Henrietta said that it seemed that the Lord had a special will inside him that was very strong. She said that he shouldn't worry. She smiled and said that soon the flame would finally flare up. She smiled looking at the Lord and asked if they would continue to do this. A moment later, Bastian saw flames in front of him that enveloped him. He was very surprised. He looked into the flame and said it looked like a bird. Henrietta smiled and said that it looked like a desert phoenix. He looked at her in bewilderment. She said that the desert phoenix represented invulnerability, and according to legends, this divine creature would bring him victory. He looked in surprise at the fire that enveloped him, and the bird. And Wednesday looked at him and asked if he was really worried about his wife. Now she understood why he had been so sensitive all evening. Henrietta looked at him and said that the Marquise had never lost, and she would win again this time. A moment later, the flames died down and the bird flew away. Luke came into the room and said with a smile that of course she would win. Everyone looked at the Marquise in surprise. She looked at them with a smile and said that she was a little late. Bastian, in turn, could not take his eyes off his beautiful wife, who was heading towards him. A moment later, he changed and became like a devoted puppy. He called her with a smile. He smiled and told her not to move, as he would come to her himself. He smiled and said with embarrassment that he had almost gone crazy because he missed her so much. The young lady smiled and apologized. She said that it takes a long time to put on this uniform. He smiled and said that, as he always says, he wouldn't mind waiting forever to see her. He said that she looked especially lovely today. The young lady looked at her husband and asked if he danced well. He looked at her in bewilderment. She smiled and said that the host had a privilege and had to dance the first dance with the special guest of the day. She looked at him and asked him with a smile if he liked dancing. He smiled shyly and said that he didn't. She smiled and said that she thought so. Bastian twirled her around in a dance and said that he thought he now understood why people dance. The young lady looked at her husband with confusion, as she did not expect such a thing. He looked at her intently and said that he didn't know how she felt about him. The young lady looked at him intently. She wondered if he would tell her again that he loved her. She knew that he usually did. She remembered that when he proposed to her, he said it as if he were challenging her to a duel, but now his manner of speech had become much softer. He looked at her and said that she would hear the rest when she returned. The young lady was furious and said it was unfair because she wanted to know now. Bastian smiled a sly smile and asked if she was curious. He kissed her hand tenderly and said that she should return safely to hear the rest. He tenderly said that he would wait for her here. The young lady looked at him intently. She was very embarrassed. The Archduke, in turn, watched them closely. He was angry, and he did not like what he saw at all. A moment later, she took the candy wrapper and set it on fire. The room burst into flames. Everyone looked at the candle in surprise. They stared at the picture, because they did not know whether it was a star or a tree. Bella, in turn, looked criminally at the fire and said that it was her family's coat of arms, the brightest red cross, and thorns in the desert. The Viscountess smiled and told the young lady that it looked like she would be the head of her family in the future. Bastian looked at the young lady intently and said with a grin that it was very unfortunate that she would be the future head of the family. She looked at him furiously and asked what he had just said. The Lord said that it was obvious that her elder sister should be the next Duchess, no matter how she looked at it, and it made no sense for her to be chosen as the next Duchess when her sister was so much better than her. She looked at him with fury and said that he was in no position to worry about the future of her family. She asked what about his house, which only he had. Bastian looked at her intently frowning as he asked why he had to be the only one at his house. He looked at her and said with a smirk that they now had Luc Bichel. Everyone present was shocked by this statement. Constantine looked at him and asked if he really meant to say that he would make the Marquise the next Duchess. Bastian looked at the young man with disdain and asked how he dared to raise his hand against him. He told him to let him go right now. Constantine looked at him and told him to answer his question first, and then he would let him go. Bastian asked in bewilderment why he should do this. He said that he had no desire to answer this question. Constantine was shocked. The Marquise told Constantine that if he valued the reputation he had built with these wrists, he had better let him go now. Otherwise, he would make sure that Constantine would never be able to pick up a sword again. Bastian said that he bet that Constantine thought his words were empty. He asked Constantine if he really believed that he, the son of a duke, could not cope with such a threat. Constantine, gritting his teeth, looked at Bastian and threw his hand away with a scream. Constantine shouted to the Lord that from the moment he first saw him, he immediately did not like him, since all he does is just chat. Constantine left in anger and abandoned their company. He could no longer bear Bastian's presence. The Lord looked at the young lady and said that he took back his words about paying her a generous fee. The Viscountess looked at him in bewilderment. He said he thought she said he was going to be lucky today, but with all the annoying idiots here to pick on him, he said that if today was supposed to be his lucky day, then he thought he had a good idea of what his future looked like. The young lady laughed quietly, for she thought he had brought this upon himself. She looked at him and said with a smile that everything was just beginning, and that there was a long and beautiful night ahead. She said that perhaps her abacus was not the same as it used to be, but her ability was simply to predict fate, and it still worked. She looked at him and asked if he could pass her the candy he had chosen. They sat in silence for a while, looking at each other. The young lady looked at him and asked if he could pass her some candy. Bastian sighed heavily and said that he felt like he had wasted his time on a pointless scheme. He asked if she was sure she could do it. Henrietta smiled and said that she was, of course, confident in her abilities, and also asked if he had chosen the candy. A moment later, he handed them a purple candy, and Henrietta smiled. He smiled and said that he chose this particular candy because it was the same color as his wife's eyes. The Viscountess was completely pleased, and smiling, Bella in turn could not understand whether he was seriously blushing because of this. Henrietta smiled and said it was very good, and asked if she could have a look. A moment later, she held the wrapper to the fire, but it did not catch fire. Bella was surprised and did not understand why this was happening. She did not understand why the wrapper did not burn. Henrietta said that magic is the unification of consciousnesses. Henrietta said that it seemed that the Lord had a special will inside him that was very strong. She said that he shouldn't worry. She smiled and said that soon the flame would finally flare up. She smiled looking at the Lord and asked if they would continue to do this. A moment later, Bastian saw flames in front of him that enveloped him. He was very surprised. He looked into the flame and said it looked like a bird. Henrietta smiled and said that it looked like a desert phoenix. He looked at her in bewilderment. She said that the desert phoenix represented invulnerability, and according to legends, this divine creature would bring him victory. He looked in surprise at the fire that enveloped him, and the bird. And Wednesday looked at him and asked if he was really worried about his wife. Now she understood why he had been so sensitive all evening. Henrietta looked at him and said that the Marquise had never lost, and she would win again this time. A moment later, the flames died down and the bird flew away. Luc came into the room and said with a smile that of course she would win. Everyone looked at the Marquise in surprise. She looked at them with a smile and said that she was a little late. Bastian, in turn, could not take his eyes off his beautiful wife, who was heading towards him. A moment later, he changed and became like a devoted puppy. He called her with a smile. He smiled and told her not to move, as he would come to her himself. He smiled and said with embarrassment that he had almost gone crazy because he missed her so much. The young lady smiled and apologized. She said that it takes a long time to put on this uniform. He smiled and said that, as he always says, he wouldn't mind waiting forever to see her. He said that she looked especially lovely today. The young lady looked at her husband and asked if he danced well. He looked at her in bewilderment. She smiled and said that the host had a privilege and had to dance the first dance with the special guest of the day. She looked at him and asked him with a smile if he liked dancing. He smiled shyly and said that he didn't. She smiled and said that she thought so. Bastian twirled her around in a dance and said that he thought he now understood why people dance. The young lady looked at her husband with confusion, as she did not expect such a thing. He looked at her intently and said that he didn't know how she felt about him.